Handcuffed and humiliated, I sat in the interrogation room, the product of their latest setup. Drugs planted in my house, officers smirking as they booked me. This wasn't just personal, it was calculated. But I had evidence. Hidden cameras had captured it all, including Samantha smashing a priceless vase. Kingston thought his power made him untouchable, but his arrogance blinded him. When I stood before the judge, the truth began to surface. The tides were turning, but the fight was far from over. They wanted me broken, but I was just getting started. My revenge would be as public as their betrayal. That's exactly where I was when Fuchs and his team came back to the police station 2 hours later. The use of the interview rooms for a drug case was causing some trouble. The weeks before Christmas are very busy for the police, so the rooms were often booked. But it wasn't just the use of an interview room that caused issues. Problems began as soon as I got there. The constable led me to the charge area. The main issue was that he didn't have any details about why I was there. When the custody officer asked me about my charges, I could only shrug and say I must have upset Detective Sergeant Fuchs by suggesting he could lose some weight. Since the constable hadn't mentioned drugs, I decided to stay quiet about that topic. Was Mr. Bork formally arrested? The custody officer asked the constable. I don't know, Sergeant, the constable replied. I was just told to bring him in, process him, and have him ready in an interview room for Detective Sergeant Fuchs. The custody officer then looked at me. Were you arrested, Mr. Bork? He asked. Not that I know of, I answered honestly. I thought I was invited to help with their questions. So why are you here with handcuffs on? He asked. You'll have to ask Detective Sergeant Fuchs about that, I said. But I think bullies do this when their victims don't give in. You've known him longer than I have. What do you think? I think you might be right, he mumbled to himself. As you're not under arrest, I can't process you, the sergeant said. He then told the constable to take me to an open interview room. Once you've got him settled, take the cuffs off and get him something to eat and drink. If Fuchs is like usual, he'll make him wait a couple of hours before questioning him. Oh, and see if you can find a newspaper for Mr. Bork to read while he waits. He might be there for a while. Let him have a bathroom break while waiting for a room to open up. While the custody situation was happening, I saw Moyston and Buchanan come into the room. As I was being led out, I accidentally bumped into Constable Buchanan, handing her key back to her. Sorry about that, I mumbled as I pulled myself away from her. Sorry, miss, I said more clearly as I regained my balance. Bad leg. Old injury, you know. It was my pleasure, Kate replied softly as I was taken away. I wasn't sure if she meant giving me her key or if she was referring to me running into her. After I went to the bathroom, I was taken to a long hallway. There were interview rooms on one side and a long wooden bench on the other. I recognized some faces from my wife's work. There were her co-workers. Some were senior partners, and some were paralegals. I especially remembered a person named Sam. If this were a movie, I said quietly enough to be heard, we'd want to know who told on us. Those missing would probably be the ones to blame. Be quiet, someone shouted from the end of the hallway. No talking. I'm sorry, I replied. I was just saying. I couldn't tell how long others had been waiting, but it looked like I had priority. I was led into the next available room, which pleased me because it was far from the waiting area. I smiled as I walked, hoping it would annoy those still sitting on the bench. I wanted them to think I had something to do with their situation. It must have bothered them to see my officer coming in and out of my room with things like newspapers and water. They would surely have been upset to see him come in with a large takeout bag and 2 cups of coffee. While I waited for Detective Sergeant Fuchs and his partner to come back from searching my home, I thought about how long they were taking. It seemed like they were looking through my garage and other buildings, even if that wasn't part of their search order. But it didn't really matter to me. I felt certain they wouldn't find anything important. I already knew the items they claimed to find were not what they seemed. What's really surprising, I thought while alone in the interview room, is that, for the second time in 2 days, I'm here without my personal things being taken away. I did wish I had kept my phone, but only a little. I knew that once I was officially arrested, they would have the right to take it. When the interview finally started, it went as I had expected. Fuchs and his partner came in strongly and tried to pressure me for answers. I refused to speak until I had talked to my lawyer. Fuchs and his partner packed up and left. It was another hour before Tony arrived in the room. I knew this was all part of the process. I wouldn't have been a good sniper if I was an impatient person. My lawyer, on the other hand, was not so patient. When he walked into the room, I could see he was quite upset. After making sure our talk wasn't being recorded, I had asked Tony to bring in Charlie's special item before we left the farm. I updated him on what was happening. I left out some details about my plans, just like I would have done if I were speaking to Brad. But I was sure he understood what I meant. During our talk, he told me that even after a warning, Fuchs went and searched the outbuildings. They claimed to have found more drugs, including cocaine and other substances meant for sale. Before the police detectives came back to ask me more questions, I asked Tony to take some pictures of my face and hands with his phone. I held up a newspaper provided by the police to show the date in those photos. I also had him use my other phone to send a message to someone labeled JF. I had written the message on a piece of newspaper, and it said, "Be prepared for my situation. Also expect this to last longer at this location. I need support. You know what?" I told Tony not to worry about a reply, since I trusted they would arrange the protection I asked for. I asked him to delete the message and any answers before turning off the phone. Tony suggested I stick to basic information like name and rank during the questioning, and that's exactly what we did. At the end of the questioning, a police officer came in, and I was handcuffed and taken to the holding area. It was then that I was officially charged with having a significant amount of illegal drugs. I had to give up my belongings and was taken to a cell. While being charged, I received my first warning, which I decided to keep to myself. The next morning, I was placed in a police van and taken to a nearby city for a hearing. The magistrate was surprised that I had been brought so far for what was really just a hearing. When they read the charges, she asked if I had a lawyer. "I do, ma'am," I responded. "But it seems my lawyer wasn't informed about this change. I would like to ask respectfully if we could postpone this hearing until I can inform him about what happened." She looked at the police officer present, who was a senior constable. "Is there any truth to Mr. Bork's claim, Senior Constable Bishop?" the magistrate asked. "Of course not, Your Honor," he replied. "This is a clear case of drug possession intended for sale. I think Mr. Bork is just trying to buy time. His lawyer must know about the change in location because the court in Morton City is busy, Your Honor." "Still, Mr. Prosecutor, Mr. Bork deserves good legal help," the magistrate said. "This is not the first time something like this has occurred, especially with drug cases. I'm going to postpone this hearing until next Wednesday morning. I expect to see a lawyer with the accused then." "As you wish, Your Honor," the senior constable replied, looking displeased. "Thank you, ma'am," I said. I thought about asking to have the case dropped, but I decided to wait. I knew I had strong reasons to ask, but I thought it would be better to present them in front of more people. If I understood the procedures right, the magistrate would send me to a higher court with or without bail. I reminded myself to be patient. I had spent many uncomfortable days waiting to catch someone so I could handle a bit of time in a cell. Note to self, I thought as I was taken out of the courtroom, ask Tony to bring me a few books to read while I wait for my next court date. When I got back to my spot in the city watch house, I found my single cell had turned into a double. A thin, tattooed young man was lying on my bunk with a dazed look and a goofy smile that told me he was on drugs. "You know you're on my bunk, right?" I asked calmly. "What if I am? What are you going to do about it?" he replied, clearly aware. I quickly realized I was in another tricky situation, especially when I saw him glance at the camera in the corner of the cell. "Not much," I said. "I wouldn't sleep on that mattress after you've used it. At least the new mattress and blanket are fresh and clean. Just so you know, if you want to get up for any reason, let me know. I'm a light sleeper and have some issues from my past that make it tough for me to control my reactions while I sleep. There was an incident in Afghanistan where I almost harmed my roommate in my sleep. They let me sleep alone after that. While we're still friends, he now talks in a funny voice. That's how he got his nickname. That was long ago. I haven't done anything like that since. But honestly, I haven't had to share a space with anyone else, except for my wife, who had her own ways of enjoying our time together. She actually liked it when I embraced her tightly, almost to the point of losing consciousness. It's probably not a great idea to climb into bed with me. I might end up being a bit too rough. She enjoyed that too. How about we wait until after the lights go out and I show you myself? As I was explaining why I didn't plan to speak up about him taking my bed, he was knocking on the door, asking to be moved to another room. When they came for him, I made sure they took the bedding he had been using. I then made my bed with clean linens and asked for a new toothbrush and toothpaste. Who knows what he had done with my old ones? Later that afternoon, Tony Marino stopped by to confirm what I thought had happened that morning. "I heard you held your ground," he said. "Good job. Brad mentioned you were quick on your feet, but after seeing you yesterday, I didn't realize how well you could move. You also have good luck on your side. If it had been anyone else, you might already be in trouble. Margaret Johnston is strict about the law and won't allow unfair treatment, but beware if she thinks you're guilty, especially in cases involving women or children, she can be tough. If we see her again on Wednesday, there might be a chance for bail. We could even stop the whole thing before it gets too far. I know you might want to make this a big event, but you need to think about how this case affects your reputation. The longer we wait, the more harm it will cause." "My reputation is already damaged," I replied. "It took a hit when they raided my business and tried to take my car. It got worse when someone invited the media to see the chaos. Their failure to handle it properly turned things around for me. The damage to my name got even worse yesterday when they called the media again to witness what they thought would be my downfall. My construction business might never recover. They'll have to deal with that. As someone once said, 'He who steals my money takes little, but he who takes my good name leaves me poor.' I'm sure they would pay for it. We both know that bad stories stick. The only way to lessen the damage is to fight back completely. I can't just settle for a small win. I need to take care of these problems for good. There won't be any deals, and there won't be any settlement discussions. This will be a fight to the finish. Either they will win, or I will win. No matter what happens, it will be a sight that people in this state have never witnessed before. What you see here, Tony," I said, "is just the beginning. There is a lot more going on behind the scenes. I suggest you get a copy of Saturday's newspapers and watch the next Focus program. I know that might take a while since next Monday is Christmas Day. I probably won't see any of it while I am here, but I would appreciate it if you could bring me a copy of the paper when you can." "I will," Tony replied. "With some luck, you might get to watch it from home when it airs. If not, I'll record it and bring it to you wherever you are. And speaking of reading material, I brought you a couple of books to keep you busy until your next hearing. I hope you enjoy Tom Clancy." "I do. Thank you for that. You must have been reading my mind because I was going to ask you to bring something for me." "If you want to know more about the situation," I said as Tony stood to leave, "talk to Brad. He can tell you what to expect to read and see in the media in the upcoming days and weeks. And please tell him to stay where he is until this is all over. His safety could be at risk if he comes back too soon." "Oh, before I forget," he said before knocking to have the door opened. "I got a reply to the text I sent yesterday. It just said, 'Done.' A guard came to take me back to my cell just a minute or two after Tony left. I was surprised that, after a quick check, I was allowed to keep the books and a copy of that morning's newspaper that Tony had brought in for me. I thought they might take them away just to be difficult. "Local builder arrested in drug raid" was the headline of the article on page 3 about the raid at my house. After reading it, I realized that whoever wrote the article hadn't even been there. It was based on a news release from the police. It had very little real information but a lot of guesses and suggestions. The story included my name and mentioned that they tried to take my car a few days earlier. While it didn't say I was guilty, it made it clear to readers that I was involved in some serious wrongdoing related to drugs. The article then talked about the harm drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, and recreational drugs due to those who are addicted and to the state's economy. While it didn't specify what drugs were found at my place, it implied that the drugs mentioned were discovered during the raid. They were digging a big hole for me. But as I told Tony earlier, they don't realize how much trouble this is going to cause them. I understood what they were trying to do. If I managed to survive Kingston's orders, no one would believe me if I spoke against them. I would just be seen as the upset husband of a woman who had pulled away from me after learning about my connections with drugs. She would claim that her relationship with Kingston started only after we separated. Oddly enough, there was no mention of the arrest of MCL partners. You would think that the arrest of key people in a well-known law firm for drug charges would be big news, but it wasn't. Maybe Kingston had more friends than I realized. Sitting on my bunk, I wondered if Kingston and his group knew about Manyweather. I was sure that Sam and her boss wouldn't know. The problem was that Charlie was aware of them. There's a good chance she would connect Manyweather with Kingston and his team to make up for their missing contractors. He wanted me out of the way anyway, so he could profit from it. The main difference between Kingston and Manyweather was their approach. Kingston wanted me gone quickly, while Manyweather preferred to stretch things out. In the end, Kingston wouldn't mind, as long as he got the assurance that I would be out of their way before I could cause more trouble. I realized there was nothing I could do while locked up. So I set the newspaper down and picked up one of the books Tony had given me. One thing I know, I told myself, starting to read, is that Prancer won't be sitting still. He'll do everything he can to help me get through this. And he was. What I didn't learn until later was that while I was dealing with my troubles in town, Tommy had sent a team to my house. They filled my home and outbuildings with cameras, making it easy to see everything. The entire search and setup were recorded, including Sam's intentional damage to my Ching vase. This showed that she was working with some members of the drug squad. On Saturday, I was brought in for 2 more interviews, which ended up being pointless because the detectives hadn't informed my lawyer. We sat in silence for an hour each time. Finally, they took me back to my cell. On Sunday morning, I was told to shave and shower and was given a clean set of clothes. Then I was led to the courtyard and handed over to 2 uniformed officers for transportation. Neither they nor I showed any sign of recognition. I was just glad that wherever I was going, I would be in a car instead of a cramped van. "Well, you seem to be holding up well," Constable Buchanan said from the front seat after we left the police station. "Looks like you've managed to stay out of trouble." "It wasn't for lack of trying," I replied with a smile. It was nice to see some friendly faces again. They tried to get me into a fight in my cell, but I talked my way out of it. "What happened?" Mitch Moyston asked, sounding curious. I shared how a troubled person had been put in my cell on Friday, and how I convinced him he would be better off if he asked to be moved to another cell. They both laughed. "Typical drug squad," Mitch said. "They stir up a little trouble and then take you outside. They probably wanted to keep you in a tough spot long enough for you to miss your next court date. In your absence, they'd tell the magistrate that you were too dangerous to be out on bail and should stay in custody for everyone's safety." During that ride, I found out that Tommy had put cameras in my home. Apparently, Alan McGregor had gotten a copy of the videos, which showed, among other things, evidence being planted in my house and garage. It seems that after talking with your lawyer, Chief Superintendent McGregor has decided to wait on using that evidence until your case is finished. Your lawyer wants all of it made public so it can be used for several other matters that are coming up. "So where are you taking me?" I asked as they appeared to be driving west, away from the city. "We're going to Bremer City. You have a court date," Mitch replied. "Looks like your lawyer has some pull. He set up a special hearing before Her Honor Miss Margaret Johnston." "With respect, Your Honor," Tony said after the police prosecutor laid out the basics of the case, "I ask that you see this case for the story it is and dismiss the charges against my client." "What are your reasons for making such a request, Mr. Marino?" the magistrate asked. "It seems drugs were found at your client's home. Since I have not yet seen the evidence the prosecution plans to use against my client, could I ask my colleague a few questions, Your Honor?" "Yes, but keep it short," the magistrate replied. "Senior Constable Bishop," Tony said, looking at the police prosecutor, "can you tell me why the drug squad raided my client's house?" After getting permission from the magistrate, the prosecutor spoke with a man in the audience. Tony recognized him as the detective who was said to have discovered the drugs in his storage area. "The police acted on a tip about the accused's drug activities," the prosecutor replied. "Was that tip from a confidential informant or an anonymous source?" Tony asked. "From an anonymous source," the prosecutor said after talking again with the detective. Was that the same anonymous source that led to the combined raid on my client's business 2 days before, Mr. Prosecutor? That's hard to say, the prosecutor replied after consulting with his colleague again. It seems the informant's voice was disguised in both instances. Were both tips disguised in the same manner? The magistrate asked. After looking back at the detective and receiving a nod, the prosecutor confirmed they were. Would the person you are speaking about please stand and identify himself? The magistrate instructed the man behind the prosecutor. I'm Detective Senior Constable John Henry Case, Your Honor, he said as he stood. And what is your role in this case, Detective? Magistrate Johnston asked. I took part in the raids on both the accused's business and home, Your Honor, he answered. Thank you, Senior Constable Case, the magistrate said. You may now leave. Any further contributions will be as a sworn witness. Your behavior in my courtroom today has not followed proper procedure, Senior Constable Bishop, the magistrate told the police prosecutor. In the future, you will introduce those you need to refer to as witnesses so they can be questioned by the defense. Do you understand, Senior Constable Bishop? Yes, ma'am, the embarrassed prosecutor replied. I apologize, ma'am. Are you suggesting that the police made up evidence, Mr. Marino? The magistrate asked, turning back to Tony. Goodness, no, he responded. I would never imply the prosecution would go that far. But I do believe that someone who wants to harm my client is trying to ruin his reputation by planting false evidence. They did not succeed in their plan at his workplace on Tuesday, so they set up another attempt at his home. The big question is how they got into his house to plant the drugs. As the detective sitting in the gallery will tell you, Mr. Bork's home is likely more secure than a bank, said Magistrate Johnston after some thought. She decided not to dismiss the charges, but rejected the prosecution's request to keep me in custody. Instead, she allowed me to stay free on my own promise to return. She ordered me to give up my passport within 3 days and to check in at my nearest police station every week. I agree with Mr. Marino that this case doesn't smell right, she said. I'm not going to harm an innocent man's reputation and business on possibly unreliable evidence, though it may already be affected. That said, I can't ignore that there is some evidence of a crime, she continued. Mr. Bork, you will need to come back at 10 o'clock on the morning of January 14th for a hearing, at which time you'll need to enter a plea. Please talk to your lawyer about your options. Thank you, Your Honor, Tony said for me. Senior Constable Bishop, she said, looking at the police prosecutor. Make sure you're prepared. I'm not happy with what I see here. It seems to me that you haven't been fully briefed on this case, yet you came here expecting everything to go your way. Make sure to do your homework before this case comes back in 3 weeks, she warned. I will have questions. The magistrate then ended the hearing, and my 2 escorts took me back to the watch house to get my belongings and be officially released. It felt good not to be wearing handcuffs. I'm sure the boss will want to talk with you, Moyston said, excited about my release. Kate Buchanan, especially, couldn't stop smiling. Tony met me in front of the watch house and offered to buy me a good cup of coffee. I eagerly accepted. The only coffee I had since my arrest was the low-quality instant kind they served inmates and the poor takeaway he bought for me earlier that morning. As we got into his Audi, he gave me an envelope containing everything I had handed him before my arrest. The drug squad was so focused on their evidence that they didn't even ask why I didn't have keys or a phone when they took me in. The envelope also held Charlie's special item. About 30 minutes after leaving the watch house, Tony parked near a coffee shop and bookstore by the river, on the other side of town from the Bremer courthouse. He chose a table outside and suggested that I look at some books while he ordered our coffee. Take your time, he said. There's a reading area in the back. If you're not back in a few minutes, I'll know you found something interesting and I'll have our coffee brought to you there. I won't be upset. I rarely get a chance to just sit and watch the world go by. I followed his advice and found Alan McGregor sitting in the small reading area. He stood up when I walked in and we greeted each other warmly. So, this is what you meant when you said we might be going backwards, he said, pointing to a thick folder on the coffee table. It all depends on what's in the folder, I replied. If you're talking about the drug squad making fake evidence, that's way off. But if you've looked into what we discussed the other night, you might have a better understanding of what's happening. The fact that no newspapers reported on the arrest of Kingston and his group tells me he has influence in the media, too. When you look through my ex-wife's photos, I recommend you include some media faces among the others you are trying to identify. I noticed my arrest got good coverage on Saturday, but not a word about Kingston and his group. We'll have to see if anything comes up on the news when it airs. Alan wrote something down as I talked. Have you identified where the drugs came from that were found with the firm's partners? I asked. I have, he answered. They came from a stash that was seized and kept over a year ago, waiting for the trial. I suspect some of it is missing from the evidence storage. I hope that's the case. The original seizure was 10 kilograms, worth $3 million today. And yes, the drugs found with the partners came from that same stash. The total found with both groups was about 200 grams. That's nothing in the grand scheme, just a little mistake. And what about the drugs found during the raid at my place? I asked. Both amounts, the one in your house and the one in your garage, are from the same batch, he replied. Since we know they were planted by members of the drug squad and that they were taken from the police storage, we now have a clear link between the drug squad and the stolen meth. The big question is, how did those drugs end up with Kingston and his group? It wasn't just meth that turned up during the searches of their homes, vehicles, and offices. They also found a lot of cocaine, GHB, ketamine, and ecstasy. What troubles me is that while these are illegal substances, they are often used for fun. The meth, especially in the amounts found, seems unusual. Maybe I'm just overthinking it, he concluded. Maybe so, I agreed, sounding innocent. Okay, I said, changing the topic. What have you learned about the state police possibly using lawyers as informants? I wish I could be completely open with you, Aaron, Alan said, but that's not something I can talk about. A vague response was good enough for me. My father used to say, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind man. So, I continued, that likely means you can't confirm whether Kingston and his partners have been sharing information about their clients with the police to help them make arrests? You might think that, but I really can't say, Alan responded, quoting a line from the show House of Cards. We both smiled at the reference. And what about you? Alan asked. How do you plan to handle your situation? I could end this at my next court appearance, I said. I could do it without harming your drug squad, but that would only clear me on a technicality. I need to clear my name. The only way to do that is to have my day in either the district or Supreme Court. I'd prefer the Supreme Court, but that might take time. My reputation has already taken a hit, and it looks like I might have to close my business. But one way or another, I'll get through this. I don't know if the same can be said for my employees. I have about 40 people who rely on me for their jobs. I'll need to think about how to handle that during this difficult time. Perhaps I could sell the business to a competitor or even just rebrand it. I'm not sure. Either way, I can't back out until it's all settled. The line between us seems very far away from where I stand now. The important thing is that I need to keep the drug squad involved until the end, I said. You're in a similar situation. If you act too soon, you'll scare them away. But if we think of the story of the old bull and the young bull and take our time, we'll catch them all. Patience is the key, Alan. We need to stay focused on our goals. Alan nodded. Where we differ is that the drug squad is my second priority. My main concern is MCL. For my plan to work, everything must be done carefully. I'm still setting things up. What has happened so far is just a tease to get people interested in what's coming next. Of course, I know this is a serious game. Poor Mr. Reacher, remember him from our last talk? Still has 2 threats against him. Whatever happens with him will trigger the next steps in my plan. What follows is up to fate. Please let me know if I ever upset you, Stoney, the chief detective said. I wouldn't want you coming after me. Your reputation is impressive. It would be quite scary to see you coming my way. Or driving that white Chrysler like Brad Stokes said at our last meeting. I laughed as I got up to leave. I sensed he was holding back some thoughts, and I was as well. On my way back to the city, I shared what I learned from Alan with Tony, as much as I could. As he focused on the busy traffic, I sent a message to Brad. Tony mentioned that he kept my brother-in-law updated and managed to prevent his return when he heard about my arrest. I wanted to let him know I was out on bail and that Lisa and he should stay put. I told him that their safety mattered more than attending any family events. Just relax and enjoy your time off. I need to focus on what's ahead, and I can't do that if I'm distracted. Okay, he replied. Thanks for looking out for me, big brother. I care about my sister, not so much about you, I replied, smiling while I typed. Brad responded with a kissing lips emoji. We knew each other well enough to understand each other's humor. My next message was for Prancer. Breakout successful, I texted. I'm out and heading to pick up my car. I also need new keys. I'll stop by on my way home. Leave the car, came the quick reply. New keys are here. Get rid of your current car and come straight here. Use the back door. Do not, let me repeat, do not go home. I need to talk. After I explained what happened to Tony, I thanked him and asked to be dropped off at the next intersection. I took 3 cabs to get close to Prancer's place. He must have been worried about me because he, rather than Mother, met me at the tradesman's entrance. A few minutes later, I was sitting in one of the chairs in his office. You'll be happy to know that things have gotten pretty messy, and Sam and her friends were all arrested for drug-related issues. They and their partners have been released, mostly on their own agreements. A few, including Sam and Kingston, were caught with a lot of drugs besides meth, so their bail conditions were stricter. They had to put up $10,000 each. That isn't much in the big picture, but they had a magistrate who was understanding of their situation. You might not be surprised to hear that this magistrate appears in some of Sam's earlier videos. The other drugs, like cocaine, ecstasy, and GHB, were found in the company's condo, which has been Sam's home since you asked her to leave. Kingston has also been living there since she moved in. Tommy went on to say that while the state's 2 main newspapers decided not to report on the arrests and court appearances, the television news was different. They ignored the arrest and release of the partners' spouses, but they covered the arrest of both senior and junior partners extensively. With Brad's freelance journalist friend and the producers of the Focus program already informed, Tommy said they recognized some of the names involved in the first round of arrests. They were ready for more when it happened. From what he told me, while other media organizations were still gathering their information, our 2 sources were already in the loop. They were using their connections in the police and government to get the details needed for their stories. We shouldn't expect too much from the Focus program when it eventually airs. Maybe just a preview that leaves many questions for their full report later. It will take time for both parties to finish their investigations, so we'll need to be patient. They are trying to agree on a date to release their stories together. One good thing about the raids on the partners' homes, offices, and cars was that even though they were carried out under the drug squad's authority, they were done by a special team with higher oversight. The drug investigation team was present, but they were told to stay back while the searches happened. The warrants were well written by experts. They covered more than just drug issues. These warrants let them look at the company's computers, files, private safes, and the partners' safety deposit boxes. The only places they couldn't look were the offshore accounts, but the federal agents are working on that. Among the items taken, they found original video recordings from company events and trips. These were stored in a safe in Kingston's office. But they discovered even more in the safes of Kingston and a few other partners, both senior and junior. They also found proof of their work with informants. From what I've gathered, only 4 of the MCL partners are involved in this informant program, including Kingston, another senior partner, and 2 junior partners. It seems the junior partners are not as trusting as their seniors and are preparing their own backup plans. However, all 4 lawyers have kept detailed records of their informant work, dating back to when they were first brought in. From what I understand, the retired commissioner started this program when he was a chief superintendent in charge of the criminal investigation branch about 12 years ago. The management of the program was handed to his successor when he moved up to be a deputy assistant commissioner. This successor moved up the ranks and is now the current commissioner. The person who took over from him is now one of his assistant commissioners. The current chief superintendent is managing the program, but the daily communication with the lawyers, along with others, involves a detective chief inspector and his assistant, a detective sergeant. While the files at the police department are labeled as top secret and not easily accessible, the same cannot be said for the other end. The informants have depended on lawyer-client privilege to keep themselves safe. What I know, and what the investigators haven't discovered yet, is that only a handful of the lawyers used as informants are actually registered. They all believe they are, having signed the necessary documents. However, somewhere along the way, that paperwork has gone missing. So, the little bit of protection they thought they had actually doesn't exist. When it comes down to it, the police they thought were their allies might not have their backs. I could see many gaps forming in the legal system when everything comes to light. It wouldn't just be because of prison sentences or losing their jobs. There might be quite a few unexpected losses, too. The criminals wouldn't be happy to learn that their lawyers helped the police convict them. Sure, many of them will eventually be set free and get a lot of money in return. But they'll be looking for payback, Tommy said. I considered what Tommy was saying, and he was correct. Some of the informants might feel they have no choice but to turn against their police handlers and become witnesses for the prosecution. In simpler terms, they would need to testify against their former partners, but that would only shield them from further legal trouble. It wouldn't keep them safe from those who might want to harm them. The only way to ensure their safety would be if the government allowed them to join witness protection programs, though that could be a tricky solution. Australia is a vast country, yet a big part of it is desert. The population is small, and most people live in a few large coastal cities. Using the idea of 6 degrees of separation, it might only be 4 degrees in Australia with its 25 million residents. A family trying to hide in one of those cities would likely be found quickly. The best way to guarantee their safety would be to relocate them to another country, like New Zealand, the UK, or Canada. But that would cost a lot of money. Government officials are often careful with money, and I had no doubt that our state treasurer might welcome a few unexpected losses among the lawyers to help ease budget issues during what would be a challenging time for the current government. I could sense an expensive investigation coming our way. Those listening devices you placed on her phone and in her bags have been incredibly helpful, Tommy said, bringing me back to the present. We've been able to keep track of her meetings with Kingston and the others. Since she rarely goes anywhere without her phone and is almost always by her master, we've also been able to listen in on Kingston's plans, especially those concerning you. Unfortunately, she seems to support his ideas about getting rid of you and has even suggested a few methods herself. The really interesting information we received recently was from a meeting between Sam, Kingston, Manyweather, and Charlie. Despite their different views, they have decided to team up to tackle a shared issue: you. During that 2-hour meeting, the only topic discussed was how to deal with you. After thinking through different ideas and figuring out how you had outsmarted their earlier attempts, they finally decided that the best way to catch you was to set a trap. It was agreed that Kingston would pay Manyweather the $50,000 reward he had placed on your head for the job. However, he learned from his past mistakes and made Manyweather's payment due only after the job was done. He wouldn't even think about an advance payment. It was a matter of either succeeding or nothing at all. Manyweather agreed to Kingston's terms. He wanted you gone anyway, so he saw the money more as a bonus for a job well done rather than just a payment. They talked about their plans. In the end, Manyweather said he would create a team of 4 people to wait in the forest along both sides of the road before you got to your property. They wanted to catch you off guard as you returned home. But Manyweather, having learned from his earlier missteps, didn't want to rely on just one attempt. He also planned to set up a second trap at your front gate in case you managed to get past the first one. He figured that would be where you were most vulnerable. Having seen footage from the day of your arrest, he knew you would need to get out of your car to unlock the chain. I think he plans to handle that part himself. From what Tommy said, I guessed that Manyweather only wanted to scare me with the forest trap. A few shots would be fired, but nothing too close, just enough to get my heart racing. After feeling that rush, I'd be caught off guard when I turned into my driveway, and that's when he'd make his move. Knowing how much he disliked me for what he thought I had done, I realized he would enjoy seeing my surprise when he took action. The interesting part of this, Tommy continued, is that it seems Charlie hasn't mentioned my involvement at all. It also looks like she hasn't said anything about the guys who are staying on your property. Maybe she is on our side after all. That would be nice to believe. Yes, it would be nice, I thought silently. But no matter her reasoning, she was still working against us. Betrayal can never be forgiven, whether against one's country, allies, or close friends. If Charlie really hadn't said anything about Prancer and the others, though, we might have a chance. We spent the next few hours creating a plan to strike. I didn't want just Manyweather. I wanted his entire group. As with every part of this operation, timing would be very important, mixed with a good amount of luck. Before going to bed that night, I called my mother and brother to let them know I was out of jail, feeling healthy, and that I would catch up with them during the holiday. I apologized for not being able to spend Christmas Day with my family, but I explained that it couldn't be helped. I asked my mom to call my sister and let her know that everything was okay. I didn't want to call myself because I was worried someone might be listening in. I have never been a big fan of Christmas. Throughout my life, I've mostly seen people getting stressed and upset, with many relationships falling apart. Sure, when I was a child, I loved giving and receiving presents. Our home was filled with love, but the world outside felt chaotic. Sam and I only went to one of her family's Christmas parties. That was enough for me. She was the oldest of 6 siblings, with 1 sister and 4 brothers. Her mother was one of the kindest and most generous people I had ever met. I hoped Sam would be like her when she grew up. Like Sam, her mother was much smaller than the other family members, who took after their father. Reg was a big construction manager and quite tough. He was also a veteran from the Vietnam War, so we got along well. Unfortunately, I couldn't say the same for her brothers or her sister. They were just as big and tough as their father, but they lacked self-control. They preferred fighting to loving. Any discipline their father may have taught them seemed to vanish as soon as they began drinking, which I figured came from their Irish roots. That Christmas party turned into quite the chaotic gathering. I was seen as weak because I didn't want to join in. Reg let his kids have their fun, but warned them not to pull me into their troubles. "You will regret it if you mess with him," he told them. "He might be smaller than you, but I know he could handle all 5 of you and still come out on top." But they didn't listen, and the oldest brother, Connor, kept trying to provoke me. After getting permission from Reg, I took Connor aside to explain why I wanted to stay out of their fights. A few moments later, we came back with me helping Connor walk. He looked like he was struggling to stay upright. I let him take 3 swings at me before I lightly tapped him in the stomach. That was the end of their attempts to pull me into their conflicts. The following year, Sam's father passed away. I suggested that without his presence to keep things in order, it might be best to invite her mother to spend Christmas with us. I knew if we went back to her hometown that year, things could get rough. Mavis didn't come that first year, but she did join us for the next 2 Christmases. Unfortunately, she passed away before she could join us again for the 3rd time. Maybe this was for the best because, by then, the love in our marriage was fading. Those were my thoughts as I woke up on Christmas morning in 2017. Ever since I became close with Sam, Christmas has been filled with conflict. It looked like this Christmas would be no different. Aside from a simple Merry Christmas, Christmas morning at Tommy's house felt just like any other day. He, Mother, and I chatted over breakfast before Tommy and I went to his office to continue our planning. We had agreed to make them wait for their chance with me. They would have expected that I would take my car and go home right after being released, so they might have set up their trap based on that idea. Red and his team confirmed this. They had patrolled the forest and found 4 men waiting to ambush, with 2 on each side of the road. There was likely another person back toward town to alert them when I was close. I suspected that Manyweather wanted to take charge himself when the security cameras showed him and Charlie arriving in her Porsche. She parked in the same spot she had a week earlier. I guessed she thought this would confuse me. Sadly for them, I wasn't going to fall for their plans. Instead, I decided to let them wait a couple of days before stepping into their trap. We also needed some time to finalize the rest of our plan. There wouldn't be much of a Christmas break for us this year. However, Christmas Day is Christmas Day, and some traditions must be kept. The people who worked for Tommy were like his family. While he held a separate festive gathering for his off-site staff, those who lived and worked closely with him were treated as family. The lunch that Tommy prepared was impressive, with a whole lamb roasting on a spit, a large turkey in the center of the table, and a mountain of beefsteaks and chicken breasts ready for the barbecue. The variety of salads was also amazing. My parents had grown up with the traditional roast Christmas dinner, but we had gradually shifted away from that as our connection to the United Kingdom grew less strong. It took a while, but we slowly realized we lived in a place where Christmas happened in the summer. On that warm day, Temperatures could reach over 38 degrees Celsius, which is 100 degrees in the old way of counting. These days in Australia, people celebrated Christmas in board shorts, shirts, and flip-flops, not bundled up by a warm fire eating roast turkey and drinking eggnog. "You know, you made all this possible," my mom said as we sat in the shade of a huge old rain tree, letting our lunch settle. We watched Tommy's guests' kids playing in the pool. "No," I replied. "I didn't do any of this. It's all Tommy's work. He used his skills and brains to build his successful business." "That part might be true," my mom said, "but none of it would have happened if you hadn't saved his life. I would have lost a son, and the world would have missed out on a bright mind." When he came back, he was a different man from the one who left to join the army. Before that, he was heading down the wrong path. When he returned, he learned right from wrong and found a strength I never thought he would have. He also learned how important it is to have good friends around him. Most importantly, he learned to value loyalty and selflessness. Please don't ever make him feel like he owes you for what he is doing. He sees it as a way to pay you back for saving him. He cares for you, Stoney, not just for saving him, but for being his friend. So please accept his kindness. Be sure to thank him, but accept his gift with kindness. It's his way of showing gratitude, just like you showed kindness by helping him until help arrived. I agreed, but told myself I would find a way to repay him, even if he didn't know. "I didn't see what I did as paying it forward," I said. "I was just trying to save my injured friend. I wasn't thinking of anything else. I was doing what anyone else in my place would have done." "However you see it, Stoney," my mom replied, "Thomas feels he owes you a lot. It's not about money. He has plenty of that. But he knows your life is now at risk, and he wants to do for you what you did for him. Don't resist him. Let him help you the way you helped him." "I'm grateful for any help I can get, Mom. It's just that I prefer to handle things myself." "That's okay, Aaron. If you feel you need to give something back, find another way to do it. Forget about the idea of paying it forward. That whole idea was about money. Instead, follow the advice in Lloyd Douglas's book, Magnificent Obsession. Live a good life and do kind things for others, but do them quietly, so only you and your God know. After hearing her wise words, I promised myself I would read that book. I spent the next hour helping to clean up after dinner. Then, I went upstairs for a quick nap and returned an hour later to swim in Tommy's pool. During my stay at the watch house, Tommy had grabbed my emergency bag from my office, so I had clean clothes and my personal items. Most importantly, I was wearing my own swimwear while swimming. I prefer to wear my own things. When I got out of the pool, Tommy handed me a cold drink and led me to some comfortable chairs in the shade. The sun was still warm, but the heat was easing off a bit. "Everything is in place," he said as we sat down. "We found the lookout and the others are ready. We've also identified another lookout at your business. His job is to report when your car leaves. He'll be taken care of once he sends the message. The same will happen for the lookout near your house. He will go once he lets the others know you have passed. As soon as that message is sent, the others will disappear, just in case we misunderstood their plans. Our team will use their equipment to make a lot of noise when you are close, so Manyweather knows you are coming. He and Charlie have been waiting at your gate since yesterday. According to Breaker, the others are getting anxious. We can assume Manyweather and Charlie are too. By the time you arrive tomorrow afternoon, they will be on edge." Tommy then shared more about what had been happening while we enjoyed our day. "Believe it or not," he said, "many members of Manyweather's group have families. They spent today at home. Even those who seemed tough kept to their loved ones. With their camp empty, our people moved the explosives from your construction sites, along with those from the others, to their camp. The whole place will be destroyed with just one phone call. The careless people didn't even put a guard at the place. Not that it would have mattered much. We've left Manyweather and Charlie for you to handle however you want. You'll have support, but they won't help unless you're losing. Let's hope that doesn't happen before they hurt you," he said with a laugh. "Injuring is fine, but losing my best friend would really bother me. They'd regret it for a long time, much longer than they'd like, I'm sure." The problem with Tommy's plan for my meeting with Manyweather was that you can't really plan for those moments. You just have to hope you're quicker than your opponent when the time comes. Besides that, all you can do is try to reduce the risks as much as possible. After that, as my Marine friends used to say, you need to improvise, adapt, and overcome. With the immediate planning done, we talked about Sam and her situation. That could turn into a long process, Tommy said. Even though the police are pushing for them to be held, none of the judges thought they would run away. They were all released on bail while waiting for their hearings. In every case, the prosecutor, following orders from the Director of Public Prosecutions, had to ask the judges to take their passports. Being a good citizen, I shared some information with your friend, Alan McGregor, including the locations of safety deposit boxes belonging to the partners and staff involved. I'm sure they'll find fake passports in many of those boxes. That should give the judges something to think about if those individuals show up for their next hearing. The fact that the boxes have large amounts of cash should also help the prosecutors. The only way for those accused to defend against drug charges is to admit that the money comes from other illegal activities. Saying I won it at the racetrack or I got it from my grandmother won't work. If Mr. McGregor is as clever as I believe, he'll keep an eye on the safety deposit boxes and catch the accused when they leave the bank with the passports and cash. If the federal authorities aren't already involved, those fake passports will surely grab their attention. Did you know that, similar to the USA, there is no early release for federal crimes in Australia? No parole, no good behavior, and no presidential pardon. Nothing at all. Whatever a federal court judge decides is what you will serve. The downside is that you'll spend your time in a state prison because the feds don't have their own. You'll watch other prisoners finish their sentences while you serve out every moment of yours. If those prisoners ever find out you might have told on them, your time may come to an abrupt end. You wouldn't want to imagine how that could go. That made me think of Sam. I no longer loved her. In fact, I looked down on her. But once I had cared for her. I hoped she wasn't involved in any informant activities. Not that it would make much difference. Once people discovered how many lawyers were informing on their clients, every lawyer would have a target on their back. Any criminal lawyer sent to prison for such actions wouldn't have long to live. Sam's best chance of getting by in prison would be to either stay alone the entire time or associate with the toughest person there. If I had to guess, I would choose the latter. She enjoyed the company of others too much to be alone. Also, from what Tommy had told me about the video recordings, it wouldn't be her first time being with a woman. I just hoped she wouldn't end up with tattoos that would alter her appearance. I, on the other hand, hoped Kingston was quickly placed with the general prisoners and that he would face a tough time for a while before one of his former clients decided to settle the score. I didn't care much about what happened to Sam's other partners. Their lives, along with everyone connected to Kingston, would likely be ruined by then. I did feel sorry for those who would lose their jobs due to Kingston's downfall, but I was sure they all knew what was happening and had chances to leave when they could, as my father used to say. He often mixed up Bible quotes during our talks. One of his favorites was, "Let tomorrow worry about itself. If you focus on today's problems, the things you fear about tomorrow might not happen." Having served in Vietnam, he learned about the warrior mindset from the Native Americans. He would finish his advice by saying, "And if what you fear comes your way, face it with courage." Every day is a good day to reflect on life. Those were my thoughts when I noticed our silence, and Mother came out to the deck with a tray of leftover ham, chicken, lamb, and salad. She brought 3 plates, signaling it was time for us to stop planning and start enjoying the evening. After a moment, Mother went back to the kitchen and returned with a few cold beers and a glass of wine for herself. For the next 3 hours, we talked about everything but our plans. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm. The day after Christmas, known as Boxing Day, is important in Australia. It features 2 big sporting events, the Sydney to Hobart yacht race and a cricket match between Australia and a visiting international team. It is also a popular day for families to begin their holiday trips. Many people look forward to it. I, however, felt differently. When I woke just before dawn on December 26, 2017, I sensed it might be a crucial day for me. I spent a challenging half-hour swimming, followed by another half-hour doing Tai Chi. Afterward, I returned to my suite for nearly an hour of meditation. By the time I met Tommy and Mother for breakfast at 7:30, I felt at peace with myself and ready for whatever the day might hold. Just before we left, Tommy gave me a gift. When I opened it, I found a very thin vest. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It's a new type of protective vest," he explained. "It's not thick, but it's strong enough to stop a lot." When I unfolded it, it looked like a short-sleeved wetsuit that a surfer might wear. It would cover me from my neck to my knees, and if it worked as promised, it would protect my vital organs. As long as I stayed safe, I believed I would manage the day's challenges. I packed the vest and a can of talcum powder from the box into my duffel bag and hugged Tommy tightly. "Thank you, my friend," I said as we parted. "I'll remember your kindness forever." We both chuckled at the depth of that statement, laughter masking the dust in the air. A little after 10 o'clock, I used my new master key to enter my office compound. I was surprised that no one came out to ask who I was or what I was doing. I turned back after closing and locking the gate and saw a Belgian Malinois dog. He was sitting about 3 meters away, right between me and the office building. He looked calm and was watching me closely. I had seen these dogs in action in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I knew I needed to stay still. "Just stand still, Mr. Bork," a voice said. It sounded like it was coming from all around me. "Someone will come to take you to your office." I had no idea where the voice was coming from. There were no visible speakers around. It must have been something the new security team had installed. The dog didn't take his eyes off me, and it felt like he didn't even blink. I was surprised when the man I had been waiting for suddenly appeared. I didn't see him come. One moment he wasn't there, and then he was. When the dog finally relaxed, I knew we weren't alone anymore. "Good morning, Mr. Bork," he said, reaching out his hand. "I hope you remember me. I'm Frank O'Reilly. We met the other day when my team took over your security. I hear you've been on a break since then. I hope it was relaxing and that you're ready for what's ahead." "It's Aaron to my friends," I replied, shaking his hand, "or Stoney to my brothers. You must have some special training to have approached me so quietly." "I wish I could say it was all skill," O'Reilly said, "but honestly, it's thanks to the dog. The Malinois can stare so intently that it captivates its target. By the way, you can call me Frank. I used to be an officer, but I never earned a nickname in polite company. You're right about the regiment. I joined the SAS because of some special skills I have. I learned some from my background. I'm part Indigenous Australian and others from my experiences. My father worked in diplomacy, and I spent part of my youth in Nepal. We had Gurkha guards who noticed my tracking skills and taught me how to move quietly. By the time we returned to Australia, I could sneak up on the guards without them knowing. After my training at the Defense Force Academy in Duntroon, I completed my infantry training and went on my first mission to Iraq. Someone noticed that I was sharing some of my skills with my platoon. When I got back to Oz, I was moved to the SAS. We were talking as we walked to my office. At the door, one of Frank's team opened it for us. Before I went inside, the security chief asked me to greet his dog, Gunga Din. "He knows you as a friend now," Frank said. Then he introduced me to the big man who had opened the door. Ali Barami looked like he was from the Middle East and had a thick beard, suggesting he might be Muslim, which explained why he was working during the Christmas period. "So this is the famous Stony Bork," Ali said as we shook hands. I had always wondered what the person on the pale horse would look like on my last day. Now I know. "You're not as scary as I thought," he said with a smile, making his comment lighthearted. Frank chimed in. "The ones who feared him most were the ones who knew they would never see him. They also knew they would never hear the shot that ended their life. Funny thing about bullets is, you only hear the ones that miss." Leaving Gunga Din outside to continue his patrol, Frank took me to the elevator. After a brief goodbye, Ali went back to his video room to monitor things. As I entered the lift, I asked Frank to join me. I wanted to catch up on what had happened while I was away. He filled me in as I started making some coffee. An hour later, he left me to finish a few tasks before jumping back into action. One of those tasks was writing letters to my mother, sister, brother, and Brad. They were mostly the same goodbye letter with some personal touches. They were similar to the letters I used to write before each mission while I was away. Usually, my commanding officer could help me destroy them afterward. I wasn't sure if that would be possible this time. The letter to Brad was different. In that one, I asked him to share my letters with my family. Before leaving the office, I sent a couple of texts and made some calls. The first text was to Jim Freeman, telling him he could call off his men at the remand center for now, I added. I sent that right away. "K," he replied simply. My second text was for Brad. I told him a parcel would be waiting for him in my office safe if I didn't make it through the day. I also mentioned that Shirley would help him get it. I saved that message as a draft but didn't send it. I'd send my message just before leaving the place. Next, I used my work phone to talk to each of my supervisors to reassure them that what they heard wasn't true. Despite everything happening, the business would keep running, and their jobs were safe. 4 of them replied positively, but the 5th seemed doubtful. I figured the person running things after the holidays would want to find a new leader for one of the construction teams. My next call was to Shirley. I had been avoiding it because I knew how she would react, and I was right. "Where have you been, Aaron Bork?" she shouted. I had never heard her raise her voice before. "I've been really worried. One minute you were calmly walking to a police car, and the next I hear you're in trouble. The news even said you were a major criminal. And Merry Christmas to you, too," I said jokingly. "I hope you and Bill and the kids had a nice day. Sorry I didn't call yesterday, but I was a bit tied up." "Don't you Merry Christmas me," she replied. She wasn't shouting anymore, but I could tell she was still upset. "Where have you been?" "I've been spending time in the city's holding area," I replied, with a couple of trips to the courthouse and an annoying cellmate to keep me entertained. Like a lot of holiday stories, I was let go on Christmas Eve so I could be with my family. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned, and I ended up spending Christmas Day with some not-so-great company. I woke up in a strange place and thought it best to head home to my family. As I got dressed, I realized it was all a daydream. I didn't have a family or a loving partner. Because of that, I thought I'd visit the office, grab my car, and head out to the farm. Maybe Santa left me a girlfriend. If I'm lucky, she'll be waiting for me at the gate like last week. I hate to ruin your hopes, Aaron, but just like you don't have a loving wife, you don't have a girlfriend either. You and she might have thought you were close, but that changed when Todd Manyweather came into the picture. Any feelings she had for you disappeared when they saw each other." "I know," I said. "I think I mentioned they had a past. What we see now is just an increase in the feelings that started in Afghanistan. He has a strong hold over her. I couldn't win her back even if I wanted to." "But I didn't call to complain," I said, changing the topic. "My reputation and the business have really taken a hit because of Manyweather, Kingston, and some dishonest detectives. The only way to fix this and protect my employees' jobs is to step back. I plan to sell ABC completely and let the business run under a new management team. I aim to have a new company set up by the time everyone comes back from their Christmas break. If I'm still involved, I'll be working quietly behind the scenes. I will be available for contact, but not in the spotlight. To make this work, I need someone in charge who knows the business well. That person is you, Shirley. I'd like to offer you the position of CEO for the new company if you're interested. If not, I might have to shut everything down and accept my losses." "Why me?" she asked. "There must be others more qualified than I am." "I don't think so," I replied. "Even if there are, you're the one I trust the most. I don't expect you to do everything alone. You'll need a personal assistant to help with your current duties. Plus, you'll need to find someone to manage operations, ensuring the schedules are on track and that we keep our standards high. I propose starting your salary at $150,000 a year, plus a 5% share of profits. This reflects your 5 years with me and will increase by 1% each year until it reaches 10%. By the time you get there, I expect your base salary will be over $200,000 a year." "That's too much," Shirley said. "You don't pay yourself that much." "No, I don't," I replied. "But there's a reason for that which we can discuss later when things calm down. If it all goes wrong, Sam will only get what she can from her car and half of my Mustang. She earns much more than I do, so she might also have to pay me. It's complicated, but that's how it turned out. Speaking of which, you should start looking for a car that fits your new position. Just avoid anything from Ford or General Motors. I don't want to support companies that treat their workers so poorly. And I'm not keen on seeing you drive anything made in China. I believe we should support our own country. I also have someone in mind for the project manager position." "Are you going to tell me who?" Shirley asked. "It's your son, Jacob," I answered. I have been watching him for a couple of years, and I believe he has reached his limit at his current job. He needs to explore new opportunities and make use of his engineering skills and experience. He is being held back where he is. If things hadn't turned out like they have, I plan to approach him early next year. I think he would fit well with us. Of course, I understand if he doesn't want to take the risk given the current situation, but when you share the offer with him, let him know I will guarantee his first year's salary at 20% more than he is making now. The same guarantee goes for you, Shirley. Your first year's salary and your bonus will also be secured. And let Jacob know he will receive a bonus increase of 1% each year, up to a maximum of 10%. I want you both to understand that I am not offering you a share in the company's ownership, just a portion of the yearly profits. We can discuss shares in the future, but that can wait for another conversation. I mentioned that I didn't expect an answer right away. Brad would contact her and Jacob in a few days. I've recorded my offer, and I will have Brad's assistant write it up, I said, so it serves as a formal proposal. Everything is still open for discussion, and I've asked Brad to be friendly and supportive, just like he is with me. I want to make sure you don't feel pressured. I'm only talking to you about this now because I might not be able to later. If the last few days are any clue, I might be going back to jail by tomorrow. I chose not to mention that I could be in serious danger. You're not planning something reckless, are you, Aaron? Shirley asked firmly. Nothing more reckless than marrying Sam, I replied. We chatted about a few other things before I ended the call, wishing her good luck in her new job. I trusted she wouldn't let me down. I worried more about her son. I would think hard before accepting an offer from someone rumored to have a bad reputation, even if he was a close friend of my mother. My last call was to Manny. Instead of ignoring my call, he stepped away from his group to talk. His voice was steady and cheerful. Hey, they have let you out of jail. Or are you calling so I can help you with bail? He joked, a touch of humor in his tone. I didn't know he could be so light-hearted. No, I said. I don't need bail. I'm just out and about again. Of course, they don't want me getting into trouble while I'm free, and they prefer I don't leave the country. His laughter filled my ear. It came from deep inside him. You are quite the funny guy, Aaron Bork, he said once he stopped laughing. Now, how can I help you? Aren't you going to ask about the drug charges? What drug charges? He replied. You wouldn't be mixed up in drug issues any more than I would. After what you told me the other day, I figured this was a trap. I had similar experiences back in South Africa. And I think our friend, Mr. Manyweather, is somehow involved, he added. You are right about the trap, I said, but only partly right about Manyweather's involvement. I quickly shared the events that led to my arrest. But that's not why I'm calling, I continued. For the next half hour, I shared my plans to step away and transfer ownership of ABC's assets and debts to a new company. I mentioned that if I wasn't around, he could discuss the details with Brad. I made him the same offer I gave Shirley, which included a higher salary and profit sharing. He would take on the role of chief financial officer in the new company. I hope to be there to help, but only in a consulting role and once my name is cleared, I said before ending the call. When I entered Frank O'Reilly's office on the ground floor, I had put on my surfer's vest and changed into my version of casual work clothes. I was wearing long cargo pants and soft hiking boots, with a loose black Hawaiian shirt that hung outside my pants. My underclothes were hidden beneath them. Did you know that samurai horsemen used to wear silk capes for protection? Frank asked as I settled into one of his guest chairs. The capes worked well against arrows. I'm not sure how silk would fare against a fast-moving bullet, though. I hope I never have to find out, I replied, chuckling at his comment. To be honest, I'm hoping the person I'm about to meet will be so taken with my shirt that he won't want to damage it. That must be the person I'm replacing, right? Manyweather? O'Reilly guessed. Exactly, I said. Is there anything I can do for you? He asked. Thanks for your offer, Frank, I replied. But I believe everything that needs to be done is already in motion. I was going to ask you to have the GPS tracker reattached to my car, but I think I'll skip that. I want to keep them guessing about my whereabouts. I'm sure someone will be watching to see when I leave, but I might take a few different routes to shake them off, then stop for a coffee. They've been waiting for me for 3 days. Their patience must be wearing thin. Another little delay would make them as anxious as a cat in a room full of dogs, especially knowing I was on my way. While I can think of ways to involve you and Gunga Din, I don't want to change plans at this late hour. Sure, I could cause some more confusion, but I don't want to confuse my own team too. So it's best to keep things as they are. Besides, the fewer people involved, the less chance there is for something to go wrong. A straightforward plan is usually the best. Before I left, I informed him that Shirley would be taking over as CEO and handed him my master key to give to her if I wasn't available. After parting ways with Frank, I said goodbye to Allie before heading to my car. Before getting in, I put on a pair of gloves. I then bent down to open a hidden box that held a special item I had kept secured. I pulled out my Glock 17 and 2 magazines I had kept safe since a previous plan. This box was fitted into my car shortly after I bought it. I left the silencer and 1 magazine in the box and closed it. The time for quiet plans was over. As Frank had said earlier, my target wouldn't hear what was coming. Frank opened the gate as I drove through and we exchanged quick salutes. Unless my follower was very skilled, I would have lost them shortly after leaving. If they were not exceptionally good, they would be lost for good within 10 minutes. By the time I stopped for coffee, I was sure I had shaken off anyone who might have been trailing me. While enjoying my coffee, I said a quiet prayer. I would not ask for help ending someone else's life, even though there are stories of divine support in battles. No, I asked for strength if it were my time to leave this world. Feeling at peace, I climbed back into my pearl-white Chrysler. Before starting the engine, I texted Prancer. "Cometh the 4th horseman," was all I wrote. "Break a leg," came his unexpected reply. Tommy had developed a love for the theater in retirement, likely due to my mother's influence. She certainly knows how to make things elegant. Manyweather may have been a military policeman during his time with the Australian Defence Force, but aside from his second-in-command, Kronig, it seemed most of his group consisted of poorly trained fighters. The lookout he had set in the village stood out like a sore thumb. There was hardly anyone in the village on Boxing Day, which didn't help matters. When I say I spotted the spotter, I mean I saw his car, which was empty. However, I recognized a familiar face sitting on a bench outside the pub. It was Abdul, a man I used to work with. I figured he had dealt with the spotter after I sent a message through Prancer while I enjoyed my coffee. I wanted to add to Manyweather's troubles by disrupting his warning system. I had sent the same message to my friends in the forest. It seemed that groups like the white supremacists were fading away. I thought about which group I should inform about this situation, the World Wildlife Fund or the Ku Klux Klan. As I entered the forest, a man in camouflage stepped out of the trees and signaled me to stop. Even with his face covered in makeup, I recognized him as Breaker. I paused beside him and lowered the passenger window. "Hello, Stoney," he said casually. "Do you still want to go quietly, or do you want to go in loud?" "Since we've managed to stay unnoticed so far," I replied, "let's keep it that way. How were his men before you handled things?" "They were getting restless. You've kept them waiting for 3 days. They were starting to argue. Deep down, I think they were hoping for a good, long rest. Funny how quickly some situations can solve that need." It troubled me how easily he spoke about ending someone's life. When this is over, I thought, these guys should take some time away and visit a place that helps veterans relax and deal with their past experiences. It worried me that our government would send young men off to fight in difficult wars and then leave them to fend for themselves when they came back. Only their training kept them from losing control completely. Manyweather and his partner, Kronig, didn't see any issue with continuing the fight at home. With their focus on Muslims and some politicians trying to bring back a harsh policy, it was clear why groups like his were gaining strength. It's only a matter of time before one of these groups targets a place of worship, I thought. Maybe a mosque or a synagogue or even a church with beliefs that differ from theirs. The followers of the Ethiopian Orthodox religion might be a possible target. That would solve 2 problems at once. Not only did their beliefs go against what their own church taught, but those following these wrong ideas were also from a different background. Perfect, I thought to myself. One of those groups would no longer be a problem by the end of the day. "Where is everyone?" I asked. I didn't want anyone on my side to get caught in the middle when things got tense. "Abdul is back in the village watching the back entrance," Breaker replied. Red and one of the new guys are by the gate, keeping an eye on things there. There are 3 of us here. Donk is bringing the person who was following you earlier to meet his group. He and Spearman will take them and our 4 out to their camp for disposal. I don't know how many people Manyweather started with, but he's already lost 8. Seeing that Breaker had an earpiece in, I asked if he was in touch with Red. Once he confirmed, I asked him to let Red know I would arrive quietly, just like any other day. I told him to let Red know not to get involved unless I called for his help. I also mentioned that I was wearing a protective vest and he should stay out of it unless Manyweather aimed for a serious hit on me. I hoped that Manyweather's wish to make me suffer would stop him from doing that. Most likely, he would go for a less serious shot. The goal was to make me feel pain for as long as possible. Both he and Kingston wanted me to accept my situation before it was all over. Of course, I added, he can take them both out if I'm wrong. Manyweather and Charlie would be nervous. My arrival without any warning might unsettle them enough to give me a slight advantage. They would realize that their plan to intimidate me had failed, and they'd be curious about what I had planned. It was a little after 7 o'clock when I arrived home. I had timed it to match my usual schedule. In midsummer, the sun was low but still bright enough to see clearly. More importantly, the light was behind me. The first thing I noticed as I approached my gate was that Charlie's car was exactly where I expected, parked just as it had been a week ago. As I pulled up beside her, I knew this part of my plan had worked. The woman who stepped out of the stylish car was not the polished person I had briefly fallen for. Instead, she had an unkempt appearance that revealed her true self. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, and any makeup she might have had was long gone. All that remained were signs of makeup. Her eyes looked dark and distressed. "Sitting for 3 days in a bright sports car waiting for your target will do that to you?" I thought as I saw her. I understood how she must feel. I'd waited before, too, though not in a car. "Good evening, Charlie," I said as she turned to me. "You seem, not very happy these days. Where's your boyfriend? Don't tell me he is too scared to face things himself, that he sent a woman to do his work. He seems to think he is in control, and you are just a pawn. I thought you would have seen that by now." Just then, Charlie's passenger door swung open, and Manyweather jumped out. His face was bright red, and his eyes showed what he really felt. It looked like he was ready for a fight. While I was talking, Charlie had moved to the other side of her car. She clearly wanted to find safety before things got worse. I was also shielded by my car. In the quiet moment before everything escalated, I heard a stick snap behind me. I realized I had not fully grasped the situation. He had me in a dangerous spot. I didn't look away from Manyweather. He had moved to stand right behind Charlie. I saw him whisper something to her, and then she reached back. He was trying to give her something she didn't want. She shook her head, clearly upset. "No, please, no," I heard her plead. Soon after, I heard a voice behind me. "All clear behind," Red said. "I've got you covered." He didn't expect an answer, and I didn't give him one. I was too focused on Manyweather and Charlie. After a moment, Manyweather pulled Charlie's hair back and whispered again. I could see he was angry with her. Whatever he said was enough to push her away from the protection of her car. She was now holding what I guessed was a gun. He was using her as a shield. From then on, everything felt slow. Looking into Charlie's eyes, I saw a mix of fear and sadness, but that didn't stop her. I knew she was about to give in to Manyweather's control. I watched as she aimed the gun at me and pulled the trigger. She shot 3 times before her gun needed a reload. The man must have realized that she would turn the gun on him or herself, so he only put 3 bullets in the magazine. She might have made it if she hadn't aimed at my car. As it was, even if the bullets had gone through both sides of the car, they would have missed me by just a small distance. Manyweather was furious with her open defiance. He fired a single shot from his own gun into her back, and I knew it must have been serious because she fell heavily to the ground. Then he turned his focus to me, firing 3 shots. It was obvious he didn't have much experience with this kind of situation. His aim was off. Only the first shot hit me. The other 2 went wide, likely because the first hit had startled me. It didn't knock me down, but it felt like I had taken a heavy blow. If I hadn't been wearing my vest, I could have been in serious trouble. The other shots missed because he was getting ready to run away, as the police would later say. As he turned to escape into the trees lining the road, I pushed through the pain and chased after him. This was my fight now, and my instincts kicked in. I pulled a new magazine from my pocket while I ran toward where Charlie was lying. I passed her still body and quickly grabbed her gun, taking out the empty magazine. While still on the move, I replaced it with a full one, reloaded, and paused for a breath. Then I aimed carefully and fired twice. By the time he heard the first shot, he had already fallen onto the ground, unable to move properly. The second shot injured his left shoulder. I wanted him to experience the consequences of his actions. I wasn't worried about him still having a weapon. With his left arm hurt and his back injured, he couldn't even roll over. Sadly, Charlie was in the same situation. Before I checked on her, I returned to my car and got a bottle of water, a first aid kit, and a blanket from the trunk. I had picked up the empty magazine on the way to the car. Before taking off my gloves, I opened a hidden compartment under the dashboard to grab a spare magazine and a silencer. I wrapped the gloves around them and added them to my supplies. I took off my holster and gun and placed them on the grass next to the driveway. "Can you get rid of these, Red?" I asked. "Of course," came a reply from the trees. "Do we know who shot from behind?" I inquired. "It was Manyweather's second-in-command, Kronig," he answered. "Good to know. It sounds like we have everyone involved. Please make sure Kronig joins the others and take care of the camp," I instructed. "It's already in progress. What about these two?" he asked, gesturing to the people nearby. "I will need to handle this officially. I have to create an alibi for when the camp is destroyed. This was a serious attack," I said. "It's no surprise you wore the sergeant's stripes in our group," Red chuckled. I trusted him completely and didn't even check if he picked up my items. I just wished I could find someone I could trust as much. When I returned to Charlie, I fired 3 shots into the air with her pistol. That would match the rounds fired from her gun and leave gunshot residue on my hands and arms, just like what was on my clothes. It would also leave my fingerprints on the grip. I let the Glock fall beside her and knelt down to check if she was still alive. She was, but barely. Manyweather's shot had caused severe damage. The first aid kit wouldn't help, so I tried to make her last moments as comfortable as possible. I wrapped a blanket around her to keep her warm. When she opened her eyes and saw me, she smiled. "Oh, Stony," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm so glad it's you holding me and not Todd. I couldn't bear that. I'm sorry I let you down. I loved you and thought I could resist his influence, but I knew I couldn't when I saw him in your office. He knew it too. Once I gave in, I felt I could never come back to you. But I didn't tell him everything. I didn't give away Red's name or the others at your place. And I kept Tommy's involvement a secret," she confessed. As she talked, I gently cleaned the dirt from her face with a wet handkerchief and offered her a few sips of water. She seemed to want to speak freely, so I listened and turned on my phone's voice recorder to capture her last words. "I didn't realize what Todd was planning until the meeting with Kingston and your wife. That's when I understood what you had told me about her and the firm's scheme. I found out about their plans to harm you during that meeting. Todd offered to take on the job Kingston had set for your life. Your wife even suggested that if nothing else worked, he could catch you off guard at your gate. It was the one place where everyone knew you would have to stop and get out of your car. I never understood why Todd was so fixated on looking you in the eyes when he did something terrible. He convinced me to help him in a sudden way. I had no idea what he intended until he handed me the weapon. He scared me, threatening to hurt me in a terrible way if I didn't follow through. At that moment, I realized he was planning to harm me too. That's why I aimed to miss you. I thought I would turn the weapon on myself to escape the pain he had lined up for me. But he was quicker than I thought. He loaded just enough for me to harm you and no more. The next thing I knew, I was waking up and looking at you. I thought he had shot me in a way that would hurt a lot, but he made a mistake. He might have harmed me, but he also numbed my pain. Where is he, by the way? I asked. He's over by the trees, I replied. It's surprising you can't hear him. He's crying and asking for help. I gave him a taste of his own medicine, but I also made sure he wasn't comfortable. I'll check on him once we're done talking. I noticed a look of fear pass over her face when I mentioned leaving her. Don't worry, I'm not leaving you, he can wait. But I didn't think it would be long. She was fading fast. I did love you, Stoney. she said, her voice getting softer. We only knew each other for a short time, but I really did care for you. I couldn't imagine anyone else I'd rather have been with. But then Todd came back into my life. In a way, I'm glad he did. It showed me that a lasting relationship between us wouldn't have worked. If it wasn't Todd, it would have been someone else who noticed my nature, and they would have pulled me away from you. I would have been unfaithful to you, just like Samantha. I hope you find someone who can give you the love and commitment you deserve, Stoney. I also hope you can eventually forgive me for what I did. Charlie was struggling to breathe. I didn't want to cause her pain in her last moments, but I also didn't want to deceive her. Forgiveness is something you'll need to figure out with your beliefs, Charlie, just as I will with mine. I know you regret some of your choices, and you've told me how sorry you are. All I can do is accept your apology. I believe that your God might forgive you if you are truly sorry. I hope that's the case. If not, what hope do I have? She, Charlie whispered softly. Pardon? I replied. She. Just like Wile E. Coyote, God is a she. Charlie smiled, and I smiled back, recalling the fun debate we'd had on our first night together. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I was falling in love with you. Like you, I wished you were the person I could spend my life with. Unfortunately, that wasn't meant to be. But I will always remember you, Charlie. Her eyes fluttered open, and her smile grew wide. I caught a glimpse of her love before it faded from her beautiful eyes. She was gone, but her smile remained. I gently closed her eyes, kissed my fingers, and touched them to her lips. Then, I pulled the blanket up to cover her face. I didn't want anything to disturb her peace before I dealt with the one responsible for all this. As I walked over to him, I tried to think of the right words for her headstone, something that would capture who she was. The first thought that came to mind was a twist on a Mae West line. When she was bad, she was really bad, but when she was good, she was amazing. By the time I reached Manyweather, his cries had turned into soft whimpers. That changed when I turned him over. His cries returned, loud and painful, as he landed on his injured shoulder. I thought that perhaps a kinder person would have flipped him the other way. But at that moment, I wasn't feeling kind. Despite his pain, he was still clever. When he fell, he had kept hold of his gun, and it was now hidden under him. As soon as he could move his arm, he pointed his gun towards me and fired. Someone must have been looking out for me that day. Lying face down, he must have realized I was wearing a protective vest. He didn't aim at my body this time. Instead, he fired toward my head without warning. Luckily, I had managed to push his arm away before he took a second shot. Frustrated, he kept firing, so I stepped over him, wanting to make it clear that I acted in self-defense. Once his gun was empty and I was standing over him, I felt a sharp sting across my left cheek. I raised my hand and found it covered in blood. That was when I understood that maybe today wouldn't be my last. Charlie would have found the irony amusing, I thought with a smile. I could almost hear her quoting Maxwell Smart. He missed you by that much, she would have said. I imagined her saying it and chuckled. What are you laughing at? He shouted at me in pain. Stop laughing and get me some help. I need a doctor. I'm not a doctor, I replied, looking down at him. But I think you're in pretty bad shape. It's probably a good idea to say a few prayers while you still can. The next doctor you see might be for a very different reason. I started to walk away. Where are you going? He called out. I'm going to get help like you asked, I answered. Who knows? Maybe they'll be able to save you. Of course, if they do, you'll likely end up in prison. You've got so many charges against you that they might give you a long sentence. You'll spend all that time in a wheelchair, relying on others, I added. And I'll be visiting you now and then just to make things even tougher for you. It's quite the trade-off for everything you've done. Please don't leave me here, he begged. Why should I replied. Isn't that what you wanted from me? Yes, but that was just business, he said. That's what Kingston and your wife wanted. They wanted you to face consequences for not accepting what they decided. That was why the contract was made. They blamed you for the trouble at their firm, too. That made them even angrier and drove them to work with me. They were furious when I told them the drugs they were caught with were the same ones they tried to put on you. They wanted to make your end slow and painful, and for you to know exactly why. And you? I asked. What did I ever do to deserve this? Your actions have seemed even more personal than Kingston's. You wanted me to suffer from the start. When you threatened me, I knew I had to act. I had been watching you and heard what you said about my views on some things. That made me want to make you pay by taking away the things you care about. I started with Charlie. Taking her from you wasn't hard. She was already mine. Your friend Brad Stokes was next, but he managed to escape my plans. After I had gathered all the information from Charlie, I decided to work with your wife in Kingston. Wow, there was definitely some tension between Samantha and Charlie at that meeting. I bet you would have liked to see it. I even have a recording of that meeting on my phone if you want to listen to it later. I want to hear it, I replied, but not now. Let's get back to your story. All right, he said, his breathing becoming heavy. Things started to unravel after that meeting. Kingston had set up a plan for the raid on your house, which included planting drugs by a couple of his people. Then everything went wrong when the spouses of the firm's partners began to get arrested for having illegal drugs. As the partners faced more serious charges, everyone began pointing fingers at you. Before he was arrested, Kingston called me and told me to stop wasting time and get the job done. We planned the ambush as soon as we heard you were released from jail, but that was 3 days ago, and since then, you had disappeared. I have to say, I'm looking forward to getting to a hospital to clean up. I don't think I've ever felt this dirty. Welcome to the life of a sniper, I replied. Those were the last words I recorded before I turned off my phone. Before I call for medical help, I said, I should probably transfer that meeting recording with Kingston over to my phone so I can listen to it later. There are a few important things you need to know. The sooner we get through this part, the sooner I can call for an ambulance. He told me where his phone was and gave me the PIN code. Using my handkerchief, I took the phone from his pocket and entered the access code. I found the recording, sent it to my phone, and then deleted all traces of my actions before putting the phone back. Now for my part of the deal, I said. I'll keep it short. I wouldn't want you passing out before I finish. That wouldn't be good at all. The first thing is that Charlie didn't tell you everything she knew. Yes, she gave you some information I wish she hadn't, but she didn't share the critical parts. The things that, if you had known, might have stopped you from taking the path you were eager to pursue. Even though she was under your control, she saw you for who you are. She was willing to go along with your twisted wishes, but she kept a small part of herself safe and hidden. That's where she kept her true feelings for me, and she was ready to protect those feelings no matter what. The difference between you and Kingston is that he wanted me to recognize and accept his hold over my wife. You wanted me out of the way so you could have Charlie all to yourself. You thought that if I was gone, she would share everything with you. As she showed you tonight, that was never going to happen. While I spoke, I walked back to him and used my handkerchief to take out the empty magazine from his pistol. I then moved over to where Charlie was and reached down to grab her gun. I dropped the magazine and took one bullet from it. After putting the magazine back into Charlie's gun, I inserted the bullet into Manyweather's magazine and returned to him. While leaning over him, I accidentally nudged his shoulder. He screamed, which was probably a good thing because he seemed to be losing consciousness. I wanted him to stay awake for as long as I could. I wanted him to feel some of the pain he planned for me. I also needed to get information about his operation before he passed. I wouldn't record it, but it would help me when I confronted Kingston. He talked a lot, proudly sharing his so-called successes. You know that despite your talk about calling for help, it might be too late for you. I think I'll just sit with you until the end, like I did for Charlie. I've done that for my friends before. They found comfort in it. Unlike you, they were strong fighters, but even they were afraid of dying alone. I guess it's the same for you. Once you move on, there will be those waiting for you. What do you mean by that? He croaked, likely wishing he could shout. Oh, I should have mentioned it. All your friends are gone. Maybe they went to Valhalla, or maybe they ended up somewhere else. I doubt they've reached heaven if it exists. Personally, I think when we're gone, we're just gone, like the old saying goes. The first 2 you sent after my friend were the first to go. Then there were the 2 you had watching in town and the village. After them, it was the 4 waiting in the forest, trying to warn you about me. The last was your right-hand man, Kronig. He tried to sneak up on me when I got out of my car. The last thing I heard was a twig snapping, and then it went quiet. You see, what neither you nor Kingston knows is that I have quite a few friends of my own. They have been looking out for me ever since this trouble began about 11 days ago. Your camp will be in ruins by now. Even if you somehow avoid all the charges against you, you won't have a place to call home. Your other home will have been taken away because of the law. This means you'll end up living under a bridge with others who are homeless. Who knows what will happen to your wife and kids? Maybe you can start a group among the people under the bridge. You could be the leader of a whole new world, I said. As I turned to leave, I bumped into him again. He shouted in pain and tried to lift the gun with his right hand, but it was too hard for him. He was breathing very lightly and wouldn't last much longer, but I didn't want him to know that. I'm calling for help now, I said as I walked toward my car. I don't know how long it will take for them to arrive, but I hope you hang on until then. I just hope you can deal with the pain that long. Just as I pulled out my phone to call for help, I heard a shot. I'll check on him later, I thought. I just hope he didn't make things worse. Emergency services, a kind voice answered my call. Do you need an ambulance, fire, or police? It's too late for an ambulance, I replied. And there's no fire, so I guess I need the police. Police emergency line, a woman said with authority. How can I assist you? I walked into an ambush, I said. Shots have been fired and 2 people are dead. She asked for my name and where it happened. Then she wanted to know if I was hurt and if I needed an ambulance. I told her I was just a little hurt but didn't need medical help. She said she would send an ambulance anyway. The police are already on the way and should be with you soon, she said. Please stay on the line. I muted the call and walked to the driver's side of my car. I took a wet handkerchief and wrapped it around my 2 phones, then tossed them into the bushes. Please burn the handkerchief for me, Red, and keep the 2 phones safe. If you can't reach Prancer, use the phone with the number 2 to call him and let him know what happened tonight. His number is the only one on that phone. When you speak to him, ask him to update his friend about this situation and to send some of his people here. I will need support when the blame starts flying. I will be a prime suspect. You know how it works. When something happens, people often suspect the closest ones, like the spouse or the butler. If everyone has excuses for their actions, then point to the man behind the curtain holding the gun. Also, tell Prancer that I'll send copies of Manyweather's confession before he passed away and his meeting with Kingston about my planned removal to my vault. He can retrieve them from there. He can also share it with his friend's friend if he thinks it's necessary. Got it, came the short reply. I sat down in my car's driver's seat. After sending the files to my cloud and deleting my activity log, I unmuted the emergency call line. I informed the responder that I would keep her on the line but needed to make another call. Please keep checking in with me, she said. I didn't really need to make any other calls, but I had one more task to finish before the police got here. I wanted to create a little more confusion at the already chaotic scene. I took a couple of tissues from the box in the center console and walked back to where Charlie was. I sat beside her and gently wiped her face, hair, and clothes, repeating the same actions I had done earlier. I was still beside Charlie, holding her hand and cleaning her face, when the first police car showed up. To them, I would have looked like a completely shattered person. As part of the procedure, the 2 officers pointed their guns at me and told me to lie face down on the ground with my hands behind my back. It took me a moment to respond. I was in shock, but I finally wrapped Charlie's hand around the tissues, bent down, kissed her softly, and draped a blanket over her face. Only then did I comply with their urgent commands. Once I was on the ground, they handcuffed me with my hands behind my back and helped me stand up before leading me to their car. I was placed in the back seat. It was clearly their job to secure the scene. The groan I let out when they helped me up didn't seem to affect the officers. That groan was genuine. As I began to cool down, I felt the pain from Manyweather's bullet. The vest might have protected me, but I knew I wasn't entirely free from injury. Not much was said between us. They didn't even ask if there was anyone else nearby, even though I had reported 2 bodies. Of course, I was too lost in shock to offer any information. The next vehicle to arrive was another marked police car, parked with its lights on. The 2 new officers stepped out and began to set up traffic control. Night had fallen, and the only light came from the police car's headlights and flashing lights. The new officers kept their distance from the crime scene. The second police car was soon followed by an ambulance. The paramedics wanted to check the victims to see if they were still alive. The two police officers led them to Charlie's body. It took only a moment for them to confirm she had passed away. That's when things got more complicated. After looking at Charlie, the paramedics asked to see the second victim. One of the officers pointed to me. That was when the senior paramedic got frustrated. "What kind of operation is this?" he asked loudly. "I was called to confirm 2 deceased and check on 1 injured person. So far, I've only seen 1 body and a live person. Where is the second body? And where is the injured patient?" "We don't know about a second body," the older officer replied. "We were told there was a shooting and to secure the area. No one mentioned anything about bodies." The first we knew about anyone being dead was when we arrived and saw the prisoner messing with the woman's body you just checked. It was clear she was gone, but we can't decide that. No one told us there was 1 body, much less 2. We have no information on an injured person. The prisoner has a small cut on his face, but it didn't look serious. "All right," the paramedic said, calming down a bit. "So where is the second body?" The officers shrugged. "What does your prisoner say?" the second paramedic asked. "We haven't talked to him," the older officer replied. I watched as the medics and police officers walked to the car where I was held. When they got there, the senior paramedic asked the officer to open the door to check on me. With the door open, he asked me to turn around so he could examine me properly. I found it hard to move, and the pain I felt was real. I could barely shift. "It's clear why you aren't in charge of determining if someone is dead," the senior paramedic said. "You can't even tell if a living person is hurt. Now help me get him turned around so I can check on him, and take off those handcuffs. He can't run away or do anything." As I sat there with my legs hanging out of the car, he shined his flashlight over me. Not seeing any major injuries, he looked at my face, focusing on my left cheek. After feeling it a bit, he called the officers over. "Come look at this scratch and tell me what you think," he said. They had to admit that what they thought was a scratch looked more like a serious injury that, if it had been a little different, could have been fatal. As it was, it had opened up my cheek from my jawbone to just in front of my ear and cut deeply into my scalp. My cheek felt like it was held together by the thick layers of dried blood that had formed a protective scab. The medic told his partner to bring the stretcher over to the police car, and with a lot of pain and help, I was loaded onto it. 2 police officers stood by, looking shocked as I was examined under bright lights connected to the ambulance. They knew they were losing their prisoner. During the examination, the medic found a tear in my black shirt. When he removed it, he discovered why I was still alive. A bullet was still lodged in my protective vest. "Leave it there for now," I managed to say through the pain. "They should find it at the hospital, but don't let the officers touch it until it's been documented. The person who finds it should sign off on it, too. And don't cut the vest. There's a zipper on the back, like a wetsuit. The only way to cut this material is with a laser." "Is there another body?" the medic asked quietly while his partner attached a heart monitor and blood pressure cuff. His lips hardly moved. He could have been a ventriloquist. "By the trees near the Porsche," I replied softly. "It'll be messy." "Stay with me, Mr. Bork," the medic urged, raising his voice. "We're getting you to a hospital. You have to stay with us." "Is there another body?" he shouted, as if I might fade away. I weakly lifted my arm and pointed toward Charlie's car before letting it drop to my side. I missed the stretcher slightly. "Get him in the car and be ready to go as soon as I get back," the medic said to his partner, before grabbing his medical bag and heading toward the trees. I thought it was funny that they still called ambulances cars. I was strapped in the back of the ambulance when he returned. "You were right. It was messy," he said as he took a seat beside me. Half of his head was gone. "Todd Manyweather always made a grand exit," I replied, struggling to stay awake. "If he couldn't live like his hero, he would die like him." "Who was his hero?" the paramedic asked. "Adolf Hitler," I said before drifting off. I don't know if they gave me something or if I was just tired, but I passed out and missed the rest of the ride. When I woke up with an itchy nose, I realized that I was in handcuffs again. This time, only my right hand was connected to the raised rail of the bed I was lying in. My left hand felt free, but I couldn't move it much. I tried to lift my head to see where I was. The sounds around me told me I was in a hospital, but I couldn't understand why I was tied to my bed. When I raised my head, sharp pain shot through me. I let it drop back onto the pillow. My movements must have triggered some kind of alert because several people rushed into my room moments later. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bork," said the leader of the group. He, like the others, wore scrubs. The only difference was his stethoscope tucked into his pocket. I appreciated that. It felt more genuine. Many doctors I had met wore their stethoscopes around their necks like a badge. The fifth person looked like a doctor but seemed younger than the rest. She also had her stethoscope in her pocket. She was probably a trainee, but I decided she could play doctor with me if she wanted. "Do you know who you are?" the senior doctor asked. I couldn't answer because something was stuck in my throat. I thought about how this might feel for someone else in a similar situation. But I wasn't sure why those thoughts came to me. I hoped it was the medication and not from my head injury. Unable to speak, I gave him a thumbs up. He then asked me a series of yes or no questions, which I answered with hand signals. The only question I couldn't answer was about knowing where I was, so I gave a little shake of my hand. When he asked, "Do you know why you are here?" I could have said yes, but I chose to shake my head. "All right, Mr. Bork," he said as he finished the questions. "The nurses will take out your tubes and give you something to drink. Don't talk too much for a day or so. I'll come back tomorrow to explain everything we've done for you." He added, "Just relax and give yourself time to heal. You have a serious head injury, so your balance may be off for a while. We will work on that once you're better." "Everything else repaired?" I thought, confused. As he turned to leave, I rattled the handcuffs and raised my hand, asking a silent question. "I'm sorry," he replied. "The police put those on you. Only they can take them off. They must have thought you would try to escape while you were asleep." I raised my eyebrow in surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said. "I meant to tell you. You've been asleep for the last 6 days. You came in on December 26th, and today is January 1st. We've been asking the police to free your hands so we can wash and care for you, but we haven't had any luck." I made a gesture for him to give me something to write with. He handed me a pad and a pen. "Call this number and tell him where I am. Ask him to bring bolt cutters," I said with a small joke. I wrote down Alan McGregor's phone number. Then I added, "Burn or eat this message after sending. This is really important." I didn't know if I could trust this doctor, but I had to take the risk. He and his assistant left, and the nurses went about their tasks. In time, I was left alone. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I heard was people talking about everyday things. I opened my eyes to see Mitch Moyston and Kate Buchanan sitting in chairs at the foot of my bed, discussing the previous day's rugby matches. They were dressed in casual clothes. "Well," I said with difficulty, "it's nice to see some friendly faces." They didn't seem to hear me, so I shook my wrist to rattle my handcuffs against the bed. There was no sound. It took a moment to realize that my hand was free. With my now free hand, I shook the bed rail. That finally got their attention. They looked over at me and smiled. "Aha," Mitch said. "Lazarus awakens." They came closer as I reached up to scratch my nose, which had been itchy since I first woke up. Mitch extended his hand to shake mine. Kate leaned in and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek that wasn't covered in bandages. I had to look away from her to meet her eyes. I could see her relief in them. It felt like she was saying, "I thought I'd lost you." There was also a hint of playfulness as she realized where my attention had been. She smiled broadly as she stood up to her full height. For the next hour, my friends from Special Branch updated me on what had been happening since the night of the ambush. The reason for the handcuffs was that I had been arrested for not following my bail rules. I failed to give up my passport within the 72 hours the magistrate had ordered. However, that charge was dropped when Tony Marino spoke to Magistrate Johnston for me. He explained that I was on my way to get my passport when I was attacked and taken to the hospital. The magistrate dismissed the charges and changed my bail conditions to remove the deadline for giving up my passport. Unfortunately, it seems that this decision wasn't communicated properly. "It looks like you have some enemies, Aaron," Mitch said. He was referring to a higher-up, Detective Chief Superintendent Alan McGregor. Mitch continued, "He thinks someone wanted you to stay in custody while they built a case against you for the murders of Charlotte Brown and Todd Manyweather." I felt a surge of anger at the thought that someone was trying to blame me again. My irritation was clear, and a nurse rushed in to check my vital signs. Before leaving, she told Mitch and the others to keep me calm. "If you can't do that," she warned, "you'll have to leave." Mitch quickly apologized and promised to be more mindful of my situation. "You'd better," she replied. "This man has a serious head injury. If his blood pressure rises too high, it could lead to a stroke. I'd hold you responsible if that happened. I know someone in the police, and he mentioned that if someone causes a stroke, they could be charged with manslaughter. So please, take care of Mr. Bork's condition if you want to avoid trouble." Once she left, we all laughed together, With the nurse gone, Mitch continued to share what they knew. "Even though you're the main suspect," he said, "the forensics tell a different story. They believe 2 or 3 people waited for you at your property entrance for over 3 days, planning to ambush you." "How does that match up with what you remember?" he asked me. I signaled that I needed pen and paper. Kate took out her notebook and gave it to me along with her pen. "I don't remember anything before waking up here," I wrote. "I remember being released and planning to go pick up my passport, but that is all I recall. Everything that happened between then and now is gone." "Are you saying Charlie and Manyweather are gone?" "I'm afraid so," Mitch replied. "How?" I asked, holding my pen. "We can't tell you that," he said, "but you are still a suspect. The doctors think it's better for you to remember things on your own instead of having others tell you. We believe you are innocent. The evidence supports that view. The recording on your phone tells us what happened that night, and the bullet found in your vest indicates you were meant to be harmed. But what we know and what we can show in court are 2 different things. A lot depends on what the prosecution decides to bring up at the trial, if it ever happens." I felt worn out by the time they left, but Kate's goodbye kiss on my cheek lifted my spirits. Sadly, my time of freedom was brief. The doctors must have given me something to help me sleep because I didn't wake until the next morning. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was once again tied to the bed. I had learned the day before not to try to raise my head, so I reached for the call button. Someone had kindly put it near my right hand. A nurse came into my room almost immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Bork," she said. "How can I help you?" Her tone didn't sound warm or welcoming. Instead, she walked to the left side of the bed and checked the machines I was attached to. I tried to speak, but only a croak came out. A rattle of my restraints caught her attention. I signaled that I needed a pen and paper. She looked at me briefly, made sure I was okay, and then left without saying anything. While she was gone, a young police officer peeked around the corner. When he saw I was awake, he came into the room. He stood over me with a stern look. At first, I thought he was there to help me since I was a victim, but his unfriendly expression told me he was really there to make sure I didn't escape. He didn't stay long and soon returned to his post. My situation seemed to make him uneasy. His glare hid his fear of me. I understood that if I tried anything, he wouldn't hesitate to react. Fear can change how people act. Before long, the nurse came back with a plastic cup filled with cold water and a bendy straw. She also brought a writing pad and a pencil. After she helped me drink a little water, she placed a pad next to my right hand and put a pencil between my fingers. "What did you want to ask me?" she said. "Why the handcuffs?" I wrote. "I just started my shift an hour ago. I heard that a couple of plainclothes police officers came in last night and charged you with 2 counts of murder. You must remember that?" I must have slept through it all, I wrote. If that happened, I would have remembered something like that. "Why the silence then?" I asked. "Because you are a prisoner charged with murder," she responded. "I don't feel like a murderer," I wrote. "If I truly was, why do I feel like I lost against the person I'm accused of hurting? I might have defended myself, but I'm sure I didn't kill anyone." "Were you working yesterday?" she asked. "No," I said. "I just started my shift today." "Well, if you had been here yesterday, you would have seen that I was also handcuffed to my bed," I wrote. "The police charged me with breaching bail conditions for another issue, but I was unconscious then. Those charges were dropped, and the cuffs were taken off by the afternoon. Can we try something similar again? If I give you a phone number, can you call and tell that person what happened?" She nodded, showing she wanted to help. After turning the pad's page, I wrote down Tony Marino's number and added, "Lawyer. ASAP, please." I tore it off and handed it to her, signaling for her to leave the pad and pencil. Before she left to make the call, I signed that I wanted to try sitting up a bit. She offered the remote and showed me how to adjust the bed. She raised the head of the bed so I could look around. I wasn't completely upright, but it helped. I found I was okay as long as I could rest my head on the pillow. There was some pressure on my stomach, but it wasn't too bad. "Thank you," I wrote on the pad and showed it to her before she left. She smiled and nodded, then turned toward the door. I noticed her slip the note I gave her into her scrubs pocket as she exited. I felt that, at least for now, she was sympathetic, even if she wasn't completely sure of my innocence. 3 hours later, when Tony arrived, I was lying flat again. The pressure on my stomach had started to hurt too much. The doctors had also come by to check on me while making their rounds. The head doctor told me how pleased they were with my recovery and explained my injuries. "We aren't sure if you'll remember what happened before you came to us, but a couple of experts will come to see you later to check how much damage there is," he said. "We're happy to say that your spleen is not as injured as we first thought. It was badly bruised but not torn, and it should heal fully over time. Your stomach took some hits, and the bruises on your stomach muscles will take a while to get better. You might feel a bit like a stiff pocket knife for a few weeks, but we'll start your recovery program as soon as the specialists give us the go-ahead for your head." He continued, "That vest you were wearing saved your life. Without it, you might not have made it. I want to talk to you about it when you can speak again. I'm former military, and something like that would have been useful for our people in Iraq and Afghanistan. The emergency room doctors tried to remove it until the paramedic who brought you in said to unzip it. You must have told him that before you lost consciousness. The police have taken it along with the bullets they found in it as evidence. I'm sorry about the handcuffs," he said. "I've argued with them, but they won't change their minds. I don't know what happened last time, but the charges don't seem to add up. I haven't seen all the evidence, but I've seen you. There's no way you could have done what they say you did. It looks like you have some enemies in the local police." I gave him a thumbs up and made a gesture with my fingers to show he was right about everything. My nurse was with him, and I hoped she had caught our conversation. 2 hours later, Tony came with a court order telling the police to remove my handcuffs and drop all charges about the incident at my front gate while they looked into my arrest. Of course, things didn't go smoothly. The officer on duty checked with his supervisor after he read the order. The duty sergeant sent the issue to the officer in charge of the criminal investigation branch, who had to speak with the arresting officer and review the paperwork. Then, the head of that branch had to confirm with the director of public prosecutions that the order had indeed been given. Every step took a long time. After 2 hours had passed and my hands were still cuffed, Tony called the head of the DPP on his personal phone. The conversation was polite, but Tony made it clear that I had suffered serious injuries, including a bad head injury. "The doctors are worried he could have a stroke at any time," he explained. "With his hands tied to the bed, they can't give him the help he needs to save his life, or even move him to an operating room." He continued, "Also, he has never been officially arrested for the crimes they think he committed. In my opinion, that makes him a free man. Your team might see him as a suspect, but until they formally charge him, there's no reason to keep him in cuffs. If they're not removed soon, I will take action against those responsible for holding him unjustly." Tony's tone was serious. He made it clear that if I suffered a stroke and it impacted my life because I was cuffed, everyone involved in my case would face consequences. This could cost the state a lot of money. The big question was whether they could afford it. Within 10 minutes, a police officer came into the room and took off my cuffs. He apologized for treating me poorly while keeping watch over me. He also said that he or another officer would stay outside my door for the rest of my time there, not as jailers, but as protectors. My nurse entered with the officer and heard his apology. When he mentioned the change in their role, I noticed she looked worried. "There's no need to worry, miss," Tony reassured her. He had noticed her concern, too. "This is just a precaution. The people who did this to Mr. Bork are no longer a threat. I'm sorry I haven't introduced myself," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Anthony Marino, Aaron's lawyer, and you've met my visitor." I'm Madeline Baker, the nurse said. I am Mr. Bork's primary care nurse. No, I replied weakly. Nurse Baker and I haven't been introduced properly. I'm Aaron Bork, Mr. Marino's client and your patient. I held out my hand, which had just been freed. She looked hesitant. I wasn't sure if it was because of my past, or if she didn't want to let go of Tony's hand. It felt like it might have been the second reason. After that day, Nurse Baker started to warm up to me, and we became friends. She became even more cheerful after each visit from Tony. After his third visit, where we talked about small things, I felt I needed to speak to my new friend. Tony, I said, trying to sound serious, I don't mind paying for your services. I believe you are worth every cent, but I hope I'm not being charged for the time you spend just talking to Nurse Baker. He started to hesitate, but I waved my hand to stop him. You can't deny it, I said. Your feelings are clear, and so are hers. Why not just ask her out? The worst she can say is no, but I don't think that's likely. After some back and forth, he finally asked her out. After that, my days got better. His visits became less frequent, and Nurse Baker seemed much happier than when we first met. Word of my charges being dropped must have spread quickly. I had visitors just a few hours after I received the news. The good part was I was finally getting visitors. The bad part was that the first two to walk in were the last people I expected, my soon-to-be ex-wife and her boss. I was surprised they had the nerve to come, especially so soon after problems with their plan. But it seemed they were committed to their own agenda. They walked into my room like they were trusted friends checking on me. As I set the book I was reading aside, I wondered how they'd managed to get past the guard. Well, 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 I said. What an unwelcome surprise. The prodigal and her supporter. To what unfortunate situation do I owe your visit? You do know this is a sterile area, right? Shouldn't you be wearing something to keep things clean? Now don't be like that, Aaron, dear, Sam said as she approached me. We were nearby and decided to stop by to offer our condolences for the passing of your girlfriend and her new partner. As she leaned in to greet me, I pushed her away and reached for the emergency call button. In her backward movement, she took the control unit and handed it to Kingston. That's when I realized she had been after it all along. I felt relieved that she didn't really want to greet me. You don't need that, she said, stepping back from me. But you should listen carefully to what we have to say. We came to apologize for the way we treated you at the Christmas party. Nathan probably shouldn't have tried to send a message after what happened that night. He meant to let you know not to overreact, to stay calm, in a sense. However, we didn't expect you to respond so strongly to what occurred. I had been betraying you throughout our marriage, long before we were even married. I thought you knew what was happening. That night simply made it clear to everyone that Nathan had a special claim on me. By what you did to those two men that night, you made it clear that you were not going to accept this situation, that not only disrespected me, but it also disrespected Nathan. Then you went further by asking me to leave our home, the place where Nathan and I planned to build a future with you observing. That kind of defiance cannot be overlooked. So, Aaron, you put Nathan in a position where he started thinking about removing you completely from the picture. By rejecting our arrangement, you've created the trouble you're in now. Even though you've tried to undermine Nathan's reputation and his business, he still has enough power to ensure that the charges against you stick. You could end up spending the rest of your life in prison. It's not difficult to find or create the evidence needed for a conviction, and it's just as easy to make any evidence that could prove you innocent disappear. Where do you think the means to damage your reputation and your business came from? She paused, allowing me to think about what she had said. So, in a way, I've brought all this upon myself, I replied. What do I need to do to avoid being taken out by someone hired to do that, or is it the other way around? I'm never sure these days. You only have to— No, I interrupted. Let the one who calls the shots speak. I'm tired of listening to the puppet. What does your manipulative boss have to say for himself? I asked calmly, though the tension in the room was thick. His face flushed red, and he looked like he was struggling to hold back his anger. He stepped forward, pulling Sam slightly behind him. What you need to do, he began, trying to sound composed but failing to mask his irritation, is invite Samantha and me into your home so we can resolve this situation properly. You'll need to cooperate fully, After that, everyone will understand where they stand, and things can return to normal. And what happens if I don't allow you onto my property? I replied steadily, keeping my composure. Then you'll regret it, he said with a sharp edge in his voice. We'll proceed without your permission, and you won't be able to stop us. You'll be out of the picture, and Sam will inherit everything. From there, we can carry on without interference. He paused, smirking before continuing. I should mention that preparations are already in place. There's a list of people ready to carry out the next steps if necessary, and they're motivated, very motivated. Let's just say, the odds are stacked against you. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of his words settle. Then I spoke firmly. As much as I appreciate the offer, I'm going to have to decline. Sam should have told you by now I don't bow down to threats. You see yourself as powerful, but the truth is, you're just a bully trying to force others into submission. His smirk faded slightly, but I pressed on. So no, you won't be entering my home or taking over my life, and you might want to think twice about wishing for my demise. The moment anything happens to me, there are measures in place that will make things very unpleasant for you and anyone associated with you. Everything you've built will crumble before your eyes. I leaned back, letting the tension settle for a moment before adding, for all I know, those measures might already have been triggered. I was out of commission longer than I expected, and the safeguards I put in place are automatic. If that's the case, well, let's just say your problems are already on their way. The room was silent for a beat as my words hung in the air. Then, with one final glance at them both, I added quietly, I hope you're ready for what comes next. I bet a lot of those so-called friends are already trying to make plans to protect themselves. My advice is for you and your friend to leave and think about what I just said. The main point from our discussion today is clear. If I die, you will too. The difference is that I will die quickly, and your end will come slowly from hardship and hunger. Your biggest challenge will be facing the shame of it all, with people looking at you and saying, "Isn't that Nathan Kingston? I hear he once had an important job in law." I'm not sure which of my words upset him the most. Maybe it was calling him a fool, but something I said clearly made him angry. His face turned red and he stepped closer. Using his left hand, he pressed down on my stomach, right where I had been hurt. He raised his right hand, ready to hit me. It seemed like something a bully would do. I turned to face him, and from my angle I noticed he was aiming for the injured side of my face. His position looked awkward, so I didn't expect much strength behind his hit. But the pressure on my stomach was painful. As his hand came down, he pressed his other hand harder against me. Without thinking, I reacted on instinct. He quickly found out that I was not going to be the easy target he wanted. As his hand came towards me, I reached up and pushed my fingers into his throat. His eyes grew wide with surprise, and he fell to the floor like a stone. I didn't escape unhurt, though. As he fell, his hand hit my face, reopening a wound that had been healing. I felt blood flowing and a sharp pain in my head, making me dizzy. Samantha's screams brought my guard and the nurses to the room, signaling that something was wrong and someone might need help. Through my blurry vision, I couldn't tell who entered first, the police officer or Nurse Baker. They were quickly followed by two other nurses bringing in a medical cart. Madeline glanced at me as she walked in. I shrugged and pointed to Kingston, who was now struggling to breathe. Madeline directed the young officer to get Samantha out of the room and quickly started attending to Kingston. I wasn't too worried about him, knowing that my hit had only given him a small knock. If he had been just a little closer, they might have been taking him to the morgue instead of the emergency room. After handling Kingston, Madeline turned to me. She asked one of the nurses to call the doctor when she saw the mark on my face. While we waited for him, she took off the bandages and cleaned my wound. It seemed like she was more worried about any damage to my brain than about the injury itself. Feeling faint and dizzy, I didn't think about how my stomach felt until I started to be sick. That hurt a lot more than the hit from Kingston. Between my sickness, I tried to explain what Kingston had done just before he hit me, which caused a rush of doctors and nurses to come back in. After about an hour, I was back in my bed. They had stitched the cut on my face and done some scans to check my whole body and head. I was connected to my tubes and monitors again, and they gave me a sedative. It didn't take long before I fell asleep. and I welcomed the darkness. When I awoke later that night, I was surprised not to see handcuffs on me. I knew it was night because the lights in the hall were low and everything around was quiet. The few voices I heard were soft. I called my guard into the room to ask why I wasn't handcuffed. It seemed someone was taking my situation seriously. My new guard was a senior officer. "What serious crime did I commit?" I asked him, "to deserve someone watching over me at night?" "I'm not here to guard you," he replied. "I'm here to protect you. The officer who let your wife and her friend in has been sent home. He is being moved to a different area to rethink his work in the police force." "So why am I not in handcuffs?" "Why would you be?" he asked. "You did nothing wrong except defend yourself. Your attacker and your wife have been charged with serious assault. They also face charges for interfering with a witness." I thought to myself that I wished the police would speak more clearly. "Both of them have lost their bail due to drug-related issues. Your wife is in custody waiting for a hearing. No matter what happens, she will be moved to a remand center afterward. Mr. Kingston will be transferred to a secure area of the hospital once he can be moved from the emergency room. He will likely have a hearing while he's there, and will move to a different facility when he is released from the hospital. I'm not sure if the charges will hold up because they have very good lawyers, but they won't be bothering you for a while. I don't think they knew their actions while visiting were caught on video, but their time in custody will give our detectives a chance to look at what the video shows. From what I've heard, it seems they made some statements during their talk with you that might lead to more serious charges. They could end up in jail for much longer than they expected." I smiled. I figured that hospitals nowadays must have some form of discreet video coverage throughout the intensive care unit. Except for the palliative care ward, the death rate in ICU would be higher than anywhere else in the hospital. They'd want proof that they did everything possible to help a patient in case someone claimed they were negligent. Of course, such footage would be protected by privacy laws, but it wouldn't be too difficult for the police to get permission to access those videos if they needed to. An attack on a patient would likely be a good reason to ask for such access. Now I just needed to find a way to contact Tommy to see if he could get a copy of that recording, assuming he hadn't done so already. Knowing him, he'd probably been keeping an eye on things and managed to navigate the hospital security. Still, I trusted him completely, but it's always wise to check that your assumptions are right. The problem was that I didn't have a phone to call anyone. The police had likely taken it when they collected my belongings upon my admission to the hospital. It would be stored somewhere as evidence. They probably had my car, too. I wondered if the recording of Manyweather's last moments would ever be used in the case, or if it was deleted from my phone before it could be. The strange part of this situation was that even though I had been arrested twice, judging by the handcuffing, no one had come to officially charge me or talk to me about the alleged crimes. Did I seriously hurt him? I asked the senior officer before he left. Yes, enough that he could have died from his injuries if it had happened anywhere else but in a hospital, he replied. You harmed his windpipe and affected his voice box. They managed to put a tube in him so he could breathe, but he will have difficulty talking for a bit. Thankfully, it's nothing serious. He's still in the emergency room if you want to see him. I would really like to go visit him, I said softly. But I think I've had enough excitement for one day. I just wish I could have gotten a bit closer. He was just out of my reach. The next day, my first visitor was Tony Marino. He told me that Madeline had called him after things calmed down the night before to tell him about Kingston's attack. He said he stopped by last night to see if I needed help, but found out I had been given medication to relax. The officer outside your room filled me in on what happened and mentioned they were there to keep you safe and not to watch over you, Tony said. He also assured me that you were not in trouble, but your attackers were. While we spoke, I received a couple more visitors. A man who introduced himself as a detective chief inspector and a woman who was called a detective sergeant. They were with the Criminal Investigation Bureau and wanted to ask me about what happened the day before and the deaths of Charlotte Brown and Todd Manyweather. I glanced at Tony, and he nodded in support. After everything I've been through with the police, I said, I would usually tell you to leave me alone. But since my lawyer came by to check if I was handcuffed to my bed again after yesterday's event, I'll answer any questions I can. Before we start, I should mention that I can't remember anything from when I got out to when I woke up here. The doctors hope I'll remember, but there are no promises. I'll know more once I see the brain specialist and the psychiatrist, but I don't know when that will be, I added. For all I know, they might have already come and gone, and Kingston's attack may have made me forget it. I do remember the attack as if it happened yesterday. My attempt to lighten the mood fell flat. I caught Tony shaking his head at the corner of my eye. He later explained that police officers and bank managers go through special training where they learn to take things seriously, and it's rare for them to get their sense of humor back. "Thank you, Mr. Bork," the senior officer said, ignoring my joke. "Before we begin, I want to let you know that this is just a preliminary interview to gather information, so you are not in any kind of trouble. Do you understand that, Mr. Bork?" I looked at Tony again, who nodded once more. I raised an eyebrow at him, and he nodded again. I hoped he understood my question. "Why would you want to go against tradition by warning me?" I asked. With all that I had learned from the recordings on my phone, which were taken before I was rushed to the hospital, I felt I no longer needed to keep my secrets hidden. I looked at Tony to see if he was okay with my approach. He nodded. "Why do you say that, mister?" "Bork?" the chief inspector asked. "Because if you did warn me, it would be unusual," I replied. "Besides the time I was taken in after having a beer with friends when this all began, I've never been warned before being arrested. Since that first time, I have been in handcuffs at least 3 more times. On those occasions, I wasn't told my rights, like they do in the movies. In fact, during the last 2 times, I was not conscious enough to understand anything that was said." I noticed the chief inspector and his sergeant exchange looks. It became clear to me that they were not just regular detectives. They were from a special unit, likely looking into serious matters. "Could I please see your identification?" I asked the chief inspector and the sergeant. After I looked at their IDs, I confirmed my suspicion. I handed them to Tony so he could take a look as well. He took out a notebook to write down the details. "Now, Detective Chief Inspector Banks and Detective Sergeant Blankenship," I said, "let's drop the formalities and talk about why you're really here. Everyone knows that your unit doesn't investigate minor issues or alleged crimes. What exactly do you want from me?" "I apologize for misleading you," the chief inspector said. "We would have preferred to keep you unaware, but we underestimated your insight. We hope that means you can assist us more than we first expected." Tony requested that the 2 detectives go to the hospital's cafeteria to get us each a cup of coffee while he discussed things with me. He stepped out shortly after them and returned a few minutes later. When he came back, he leaned close to me and whispered, "I've confirmed that they are legitimate and honest. They're working on catching a group of corrupt police officers who have been avoiding detection for years. Your situation has connected these officers in a single effort known as the Get Aaron Bork Project. It seems that your rejection of Kingston's offer to control you through your wife did not sit well with him. He thought you might resist during your difficult time at the event, which is why he arranged to guide you when you left that night. He had done something similar for other husbands, too, when you not only avoided his trap but also turned the situation around on your attackers. He became very angry. His frustration grew when the person he hired to help with the ambush backed out and warned him to reconsider how he dealt with you. Ignoring this warning, he tried to not only harm you but also wanted to make sure you were out of the picture for good. I'm not sure how you did it, but you always seemed to stay ahead of him. On top of that, whether by chance or plan, you managed to turn his own actions against him. His attempt to harm you yesterday was fueled by his growing frustration. His first mistake was dismissing the advice of his initial advisor. He made it worse by reaching out for help in his goal against you. Each time he did, he only pulled more corrupt people into his plans. I have seen what you can do, so I'll let you handle these investigators. But when I tell you to stay quiet, please listen. Avoid mentioning names and don't explain how you did anything. I don't want you to get into trouble or put anyone else in a difficult position." When the police officers returned with our coffee, Tony asked them to speak with the head nurse, who was Madeline Baker, to turn off the video link to my room. He instructed them to keep all the medical equipment on, but to ensure there was no video or audio of the interview saved in the hospital's system. Before the door closed, Tony brought in another chair. It wasn't as comfortable as the others, but he said it was just right for him. He mentioned, I don't want to get too relaxed, explaining this to the detectives. After checking if I was okay with them recording our talk and getting my approval, both the lead detective and Tony placed recording devices on the table beside my bed. First, I want to let you know, the lead detective said, we no longer believe you were involved in any of the drug charges or responsible for the deaths of the 2 individuals found near your home. All the charges related to those cases have been dropped, and the police prosecutor has been asked to inform Magistrate Johnston about this. He went on to explain that when my car was checked after the incident at my gate, there was no evidence showing that I had ever carried drugs in it. However, during our investigation, we found evidence that the drugs at your home were placed there by one of the officers who searched the house. That person has now confessed. He also admitted to putting drugs in your garage. This same officer also told us that he alerted the news stations before the searches at your workplace and home. He did this to harm your reputation and your business. The goal of those searches was to hurt you. Tests done on the drugs show they came from the police evidence locker. Drugs from the same batch were found with the partners from Morton City Law and their family. We believe that Kingston got those drugs from his contacts in the drug squad and shared them with his associates during their meetings. I want to commend you on how you handled the situation with one of the troubled individuals placed in your cell while you were at court. It likely saved your life. They had a plan to harm you once you were moved to the remand center after dealing with their accomplice. The issue for you was that every time you overcame one of their plans, those who became your enemies were even more determined to take you down. From audio and video we identified your main enemies: Mr. Nathan Kingston, Mrs. Samantha Bork, Mr. Todd Manyweather, and to a lesser extent, Miss Charlotte Brown. Our team believes that she might have missed you on purpose when she fired her weapon, which may have led to her own ending. We have also found some people who were hired to harm you, but they seem to have vanished. They are not giving any hints about where they might be, except some suggest they could be on a cruise or visiting places like Argentina or Ecuador. Lebanon, Greece, and Malta have also come up as possible locations to check for them. While others were part of the plans against you, they do not seem to have the same strong feelings towards you as the 4 people already mentioned. Your doctors have advised us to avoid filling your mind with images of what happened after you left the watch house. The evidence shows that you were meant to be targeted, and your connection to the deaths of Miss Brown and Mr. Manyweather came from their actions. Please keep this in mind if you regain your memories from that time. Thank you, I replied. I'll try to remember that. I was starting to appreciate this man, but I also knew that the 2 officers were skilled at getting information. He had explained things well and made me feel at ease. Now it was D.S. Blankenship's turn. This brings us to the vest you were wearing when you got to the hospital, she said. Our experts examined it and said they had never seen anything like it. It's not much thicker than a sweatshirt, but it stopped a bullet that traveled a short distance. They confirmed that the bullet came from Manyweather's gun, if you're interested. So much for not thinking about it. I realized she, like the other officer, probably didn't believe my memory loss story. I mentioned Manyweather's gun, but it was actually one of the weapons reported stolen from your company on the day he left. The same goes for the one Miss Brown used to shoot in your direction. Now back to the vest. Can you tell us how you got that vest and why you were wearing it that day, Mr. Bork? To answer how I got the vest, I said, as a former soldier, I often receive various equipment to test. I never know where they come from. They just arrive with a note asking me to check them until they break. I get a different phone number for each item to send in my review, and I have to delete it right after I finish my report. I also need to get rid of the item as soon as possible once I'm done testing. When that vest arrived, I was asked to check how comfortable it was. I finished my report but hadn't destroyed it yet. Honestly, I held on to it a bit longer because I wanted to shoot at it a couple of times before getting rid of it properly. Your team probably found out that cutting it isn't easy. I had it stored in my office, waiting for that when everything else happened. Why I wore it that day is unsure. As I said, I don't remember anything after leaving the station. I can only guess that since I knew I might be in danger, I chose to wear it for safety. It seems to have done its job. I doubt I will be receiving any more equipment to test after this. Whoever has been sending me these messages will be angry now that their vest has fallen into the wrong hands. Maybe they'll come after me next, I said, but nobody laughed. The detective sergeant signaled her boss, who asked me to start from the beginning. I gave them a short version of the story, starting with when I first suspected Sam was cheating on me, and ending with my release from the watch house. I wasn't about to share every detail. I planned to go to my office to get my car and then go get my passport. I really don't know what happened between then and when I ended up here. Honestly, I wasn't looking forward to spending Christmas alone. After a quick glance at each other, the detective sergeant spoke up. After you left the watch house on the afternoon of December 24th, you were seen getting into your lawyer's car. That's the last anyone saw of you until you called emergency services around 9 o'clock on the night of December 26th. Are you sure you don't remember what you did during that time? Do you think I would lie about this? I shouted. Do you think I want to remember what happened to those two people? Because I can't forget the ones I lost while serving my country. They haunt me. Now I want to remember what happened to me, but I just can't. Suddenly, Nurse Baker burst into the room. What is happening in here? She asked, moving to the left side of the bed to adjust the monitors. This patient has serious head injuries that got worse when a guard let someone in here who tried to hurt Mr. Bork. Now you're putting his life at risk by making his blood pressure rise. If he has a stroke, or if his blood pressure stays high, it could cause a blood clot that would go to his brain and could be fatal. What kind of people are you to pressure someone like this? And you, Mr. Marino, aren't you his lawyer? Why let this happen to your client when it could endanger his life? This interview is over. Please leave, all of you. She looked right at Tony when she said the last part. The two police officers quickly packed up their notes and left. Tony took his time. After putting his notepad away, he grabbed his recorder. Good job, he said quietly before heading for the door. Madeline shot him a look as he walked by. I hoped I hadn't ruined anything between them. After making sure the three visitors were waiting for the elevator, she returned to my side to straighten my bed. Don't worry, she said. It's all good. Tony let me know what might happen before the interview began. He told me that if I saw your blood pressure start to rise, I should come in here quickly and take charge. The issue was that I didn't expect your condition to change so fast. By the time I reached the door, I was really worried. The risk of strokes or clots is serious when someone's blood pressure goes up like yours did. Now it's back to normal, but I'll need to keep an eye on you for the next day or so. Good thing I canceled your therapy session for today. I don't want you moving around more than necessary. I was happy to follow her advice and spent the afternoon diving into one of the books Tony had left for me during earlier visits. Since I had already read the Tom Clancy novel, I started the police mystery, The Dry, by new Australian author Jane Harper. It pulled me in more than many local writers had done recently. The next day turned out to be quite nice. I was allowed to have visitors again. My first visitors were my mother and brother. They had tried to see me a few times while I was in a coma, but were turned away before reaching my room. They were told that, since I was under police care, they needed to make a formal request to visit. That really upset me. I was so close to a serious situation, and my family couldn't say goodbye. I thought to myself, they will pay for this. Before I could get too upset, two more visitors came in. Brad and Lisa returned to the city now that they were informed it was safe for them. A visit to the hospital to check on her brother was at the top of Lisa's list. I've learned not to argue with her when she's determined, Brad said, so I just went along with the plan. We all laughed, knowing that despite his joking, nothing could have kept him away. After checking on my health, their first question was how I ended up in the ICU at one of the city's biggest hospitals. I told them the same thing I told everyone else. I didn't know. Then I explained that the doctors were hopeful I would slowly regain my memory. They're hopeful, I said, but they're not promising anything. They're being a bit cautious about it, Lisa said. What do you mean by cautious? Lisa asked. Well, they're telling me that, on one hand, I could get back my full memory of those events, but on the other hand, I might never remember them. From what I've overheard, though, I'm hoping I never do. To change the topic, I suggested that since we were all together, we could have a quick meeting about the company. I need to get updated on what's been happening and how far along we are with the changes. I can't actively participate because Brad still has my power of attorney, so I'll just be an interested observer. I might make a comment or two. If I do, just think of me as a friendly voice in the background and ignore me. or not. It's up to you. And feel free to ask for my opinion if you need specific advice, I said. Once everyone agreed, I pressed the buzzer. When Nurse Baker came in, I asked if she could turn off the video and audio devices in my room. I explained that I wanted to have a private meeting with my lawyer and my family. "I'm not sure I can do that, Mr. Bork," she said. "I remember what happened when your first group of visitors got past the guard." "I assure you that these people are nothing like those two," I replied. "One was only related to me by marriage. These are family, except for my lawyer, but he's married to my sister." "Wasn't the man who attacked you also a lawyer?" she asked. "I'm very familiar with lawyers. They can be quite persuasive with their words. Then, before you know it, you've let your guard down," I answered. We all smiled at that. I knew I was the only one aware of the connection between her and Tony. "This one doesn't look quite as shady as the last one who came with your wife, but he still looks lawyer-like." "I wouldn't trust him enough to go see his collection by myself," she said. "Nor would I agreed. "But he has shown he is a loyal friend and a good advisor. If he tried anything, I know I could handle it easily." "Just like you did with the other one," Madeline said. Everyone looked surprised and started asking what had happened. "Okay," Madeline said after I managed to calm my visitors down. "I'll stop it now." But only for an hour. "Just don't let him," she said, looking straight at Brad. "Get his hands on your buzzer." The question started as soon as she left the room. I briefly explained the visit from Sam and Kingston a couple of days ago, finishing with the assurance that neither of them could cause trouble again since they were both in police custody. For the next hour, we talked about changing ABC to Phoenix Constructions and confirmed the decisions I had made before my unfortunate trip to my property on Boxing Day evening. As I had hoped, all my decisions were approved, with a review set for 12 months later. The biggest surprise from the meeting was how much my younger brother Jeremy had grown up. He was taking notes for our meeting and offered several helpful ideas. After earning his business degree, he joined an accounting firm and studied for his MBA. He also got his CPA license. Now at 33, he was still with the same firm and had recently become a junior partner. His company managed my business's taxes and handled workplace relations for all our business interests. When the meeting ended, I asked Brad to stay while the others waited downstairs for coffee. Once they left, I called Nurse Baker back in and asked her for a few more minutes alone, telling her to turn the cameras back on when she saw Brad leave. "I think we might be able to apply for a marriage annulment sooner than we thought," I told him when he settled back into his seat. "Sam and her boss shared some important information during our last encounter. One of those was that she had been involved in some questionable activities for a while before we got married. They admitted that she had been behaving unprofessionally shortly after starting her job at MCL. I'm pretty sure they didn't realize that everything they said and did, including his behavior toward me, was caught on the hospital's CCTV system. I believe the police have taken those recordings. That will limit our access to them," Brad responded. "The police and prosecutors won't share them until the trial. They are considered evidence. They will keep them until the case is heard by a judge or jury. Our only chance to get those recordings into public records will be if the DPP decides to present them in court with the charges." "Okay," I acknowledged. "But I want you to speak to Tony to see if the two of you can push the public prosecutor to speed up that process. He needs to understand that showing those recordings in trial is very important. The participants in the competition should know that even if they win, there won't be any reward. If you want to see the video from that day, text my friend. Ask him to email you a copy. I'm sure he managed to capture the footage before the police took the original," I said. Brad agreed to do this to find out what happened. "Lisa and I want you to stay with us when you get out of the hospital," he said before leaving. "You'll need someone to care for you while you heal, and Lisa insists that no one else can do it." "Thanks for the offer," I replied. "But it's better to keep our personal lives private until this is all sorted out. I don't want any trouble coming your way. As my business lawyer, you're somewhat protected. But as my brother-in-law, the media might target you and Lisa. Let Tony handle the legal side of things. He's used to dealing with tricky cases. You can support him, but stay in the background. This situation isn't ended yet. I can manage better without worrying about others' safety. You focus on your work and I'll do mine. I continued. I see what you mean, Brad said. But no matter what, I'll be ready to defend you if anything happens. There are no guarantees in life, I replied as my friend turned to leave. I almost didn't make it this time. But as a friend once told me, close counts only in horseshoes and hand grenades. He was still laughing as he walked down the hall toward the elevators. Later that morning, I had a similar conversation with Shirley when she came to visit. She also offered me a place to stay after I got out. In the end, I told her the same thing. Keep your distance. Okay, I will, but only because it looks like you're doing fine on your own, she replied. We both laughed since her words were almost the same as Brad's from earlier. The one thing I accepted from her was a new phone. She thought my old one had been taken by the police since I hadn't called to update her. As a consultant, you should have a company phone, she said. I've charged it and loaded all your contacts from your work computer, so you'll be good to go. It's not your old phone number, so you will need to call everyone to let them know about the change. Of course, she said with a small smile. Since it's a company phone, you should only use it for work matters. Sure, I replied, my throat still sore. That's understood. I made that rule myself. It goes for all company phones. But I just realized that I'm not a company employee anymore, so that rule doesn't apply to me. Don't mess with me, Aaron Bork, Shirley said. Someone thought it was a good idea to make me the CEO of Phoenix Constructions. I decide which consultants we keep and which we let go. Like before, her laughter echoed down the hall. You must be amusing, Madeline Baker said as she peeked around the doorway. You've had 2 groups of visitors today, and the last ones were laughing when they left. But let's see if anyone is laughing when your next visitor leaves. Your occupational therapist will be here soon to check on you. She was right. I wasn't smiling after my therapist finished. If that was just a check, I wasn't eager for the real appointment. Thankfully, that wouldn't happen until I left the ICU and moved to the regular ward. I must have been getting better because when the nurse arrived with lunch, I felt very hungry. I even asked her to bring me a second serving if she had any left after her rounds. That was often possible since people moved in and out of the ICU all the time. I got lucky. After lunch, I curled up and took a nap. When I woke up, I noticed Senior Constable Moyston and Constable Buchanan sitting in the chairs at the foot of my bed. They were both in casual clothes and chatting about football, just like before. This time, though, they were talking about the rugby league game that night. It was a match between 2 of the Queensland teams, the Broncos and the Cowboys. It seemed both Mitch and Kate were excited to go. I pretended to sleep while I listened to them. I especially liked hearing Kate's lovely voice as she argued for the Cowboys. Mitch, who was a big Broncos fan, didn't agree with her that her team should win. Of course, whether we go to the game will depend on how well he takes the news, Mitch said. He must have noticed the change in my breathing and realized I was awake. And what news is that? I asked, giving up any act of sleeping. See, Mitch said, turning to Kate. I told you he was awake and listening in. You call it listening in, I replied. I call it gathering information. Now, what was this news that might stop you from going to your game tonight? That's the news, Kate answered. We were going to the game tonight and wanted to know if you could behave long enough for us to stay for the whole match. It seems like every time we plan a break, you get into some problem, and we have to come and help you. That's it? I asked, surprised. You woke me up to say that you 2 are going to a football match and want me to be good so the nanny can stay? Pretty much, Mitch said. Oh, and to say that if you behave and promise not to hurt any more kids, Mom and Dad will let you play with your friends when the nice doctors let you out of this hospital, he added. Once we stopped laughing, Mitch confirmed that I was no longer in any trouble from what happened since the night of the Christmas party. He started to explain the progress made since I had been in the hospital. But before he could continue, I raised my hand to stop him. I signaled that we had to be careful. It's fine, Kate said. I really loved how her voice sounded. We've asked Nurse Baker to turn off the video link. I gave her a thumbs up, and Mitch went on with his report. According to him, the information from Sam and Kingston was very helpful and connected everything. The statements from Todd and Charlotte that I had recorded on my phone added to this. While Charlie's phone didn't reveal much, Manyweather's phone gave the police a lot of valuable details about his role in my planned attack and his group. They got even more evidence when they searched his home and took his computers. This evidence led them to a training camp, which was good news. The bad news was that someone had already gotten there first. When the team arrived, it was just a pile of ashes. While sifting through those ashes, they found several burned bodies, which were still being identified using dental records and DNA. They had also found a large number of guns, including several Glock 17s, which I had reported as stolen from my storage. With the two that were recovered from where you were attacked, Mitch said, almost all the Glocks are accounted for. Investigators are still trying to figure out where the 12 AK-47 SS and some other guns came from. We have arrested a couple of Mayweather's associates identified on his phone, and they are being questioned by local and federal police. Both of them used to work for you. It seems he took advantage of his role as your head of security to recruit people from your staff. However, they are new hires and don't have much information to share. It looks like his security team was made up of people who followed him. He also tried to recruit anyone with racist views. So far, he has convinced 2 of your warehouse workers to join his cause. It seems he was also trying to get some members of your construction team involved. One interesting finding from the investigation is that the explosives used to destroy the training camp were the same as those taken from your refrigerated party truck by the bomb squad. From what we have learned, it appears the explosives, like the drugs found in your home and garage, were stolen from a police evidence locker. The records show they were scheduled for destruction. The Director of Public Prosecution has formed a task force to look into all the new information related to the different crimes we have discovered through you. The Ethical Standards Command is investigating police corruption that has come to light, and they expect charges to be filed against several officers, with the highest being a chief inspector. That leaves us, Special Branch. We have been instructed to investigate the corruption identified within the legal, government, and executive areas. Our investigation will be confidential because we have found that some people involved are part of both the State Crime Commission and the Parliamentary Crime and Corruption Commission. He took a breath and glanced at his partner before continuing. This brings us to the main reason we are here, he said. None of what is happening would have come to light if you hadn't stood up to your, humiliation caused by your wife and Nathan Kingston. Our boss has sent us to ask you to take a step back. He knows that you want to get back at Kingston and your wife for what they have done to you and for the harm they tried to bring to your life. He also understands that you want to hold accountable others who were involved in this situation, but he is asking you to trust that he will handle it for you. He wants us to assure you that everyone connected to this situation, which is growing into a bigger issue, will face consequences. It might not be the same kind of consequences you would impose, but none of them will come out of this without being affected. Those who do not end up in prison will struggle to find jobs that are better than working in a convenience store. Tell him to go ahead, I replied. Let him know he has until I get out of here and can stand on my own, which the doctors say will probably take 5 or 6 months. However, that doesn't mean I will stop gathering information, which I will share with him if it's useful. But I will do my best to stay out of his investigation. The only thing that might change that promise is if I need to act to stop another attempt on my life. If that happens, I might have no choice but to take matters into my own hands. In the meantime, if I regain my memory, I will give a full statement to whoever is appropriate from your teams. That would be CIB, Mitch replied. If you let the boss know before you contact them, he'll make sure the right people come to interview you. The team from Ethical Standards also wants a formal statement about the disruptions at your business and home. DCI Banks is straightforward, so give him a call when you're ready. The doctors were accurate about how long it would take for me to recover. I spent 2 months in the hospital, during which I had another operation to fix damage caused during an earlier incident. After that, I spent 3 months in rehab, working on my balance and strength. My friends and family visited me often during that time. Tommy Jones did not come to the hospital, but he kept in touch by text. He showed up a few times after I moved to the rehab center to update me on what was happening in the world. During one of his early visits, he told me he still had people looking out for me, just in case Kingston's arrest didn't stop his plans. Shirley Smith was another regular visitor, and she kept me informed about my newly rebranded construction business. It turned out my instincts were right. Shirley, Manny, and Jacob, yes. Shirley's son had formed a great management team. Under their direction, the business was doing well. The two unexpected visitors were Manny Finkelstein and Matt White. What surprised me most was that they came together. During another visit, when Manny had come alone, he told me he had been helping Matt with his studies. He mentioned how dedicated Matt was and how he thought Matt would be more helpful in business management than working outside. I agreed, but wanted Matt to spend a year or two learning the basics first. I want him to understand the ground level before we bring him into the office, I said. That way he'll know why we make certain choices, even if they seem wrong at times. Honestly, Manny, if you were younger, I'd have you out there too, I added. The big man laughed heartily. Plus, I continued, if he works from 7 to 3, he has more time for studying and for his daughter. I think he needs that right now. I don't care what people say about you, Aaron Bork, Manny said in his strong voice. You're not the cold-hearted mastermind they think you are. Don't try to change anyone's mind about me, my friend, I replied. At least not yet. I feel vulnerable at the moment and would rather keep that to myself. Young Matt stood by me when I needed support. He didn't have to stay, he hardly knew me. But he did, and I appreciate that kind of loyalty. I also won't forget what you and Shirley have done for me, or Jacob, who was willing to leave a safe job to join us. That was a big step for a young man. The same goes for George Casey and others who remained with us during tough times. Of course, I also remember those who were disloyal. I find it hard to forgive when friends betray me. From what I've heard about the situation at your property, I can understand, Manny said. Sadly, I don't recall any of that, I responded. And perhaps that's for the best, Manny said with a small smile. Like a few others, including some officers, I sensed he didn't fully believe my memory loss. While I was in rehab, I received several greeting cards. Most were from kind people wishing me well. One of the cards I received stood out. It was from someone who chose to remain anonymous, and it said, "Thank you for handling a problem that has troubled me for many years. The way you did it was truly fitting for the situation. The man was a terrible person, not to mention that he was responsible for the death of someone I cared deeply about. I regretted that I could never bring him to face justice for what he had done. Although I was sad to learn that you nearly lost your life, you accomplished what I could not. Justice has been served. I'm sorry that Miss Brown got caught up in his schemes and that her support for him led to her passing. Even without a name, I knew who sent it." I remembered the sudden change in Alan McGregor's demeanor when I mentioned Todd Manyweather's name during our first meeting last December. During one of his visits while I was recovering, Tony Marino told me that there were at least 4 investigations happening because of the attack on my life and the attempts to place blame on me for drug-related issues. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, he said. What began as a relatively simple issue has become much larger than anyone expected. It's starting to look like the trouble you stirred up by standing up to Kingston could lead to bigger consequences far beyond this town. You'll be glad to know that while evidence is being collected for 3 of those cases, the one against your wife and her partner is getting close to completion. Someone from the Director of Public Prosecutions will likely reach out to you soon. They want to move them from temporary holding to a more permanent place quickly so they can ask them questions, especially Kingston about some other matters. As Tony predicted, a week later, I met with a lawyer from the DPP. 3 weeks after that, Samantha and Kingston were taken to court for serious charges. I couldn't attend their first court appearance since I was listed as a witness against both of them. It was unfortunate because during that session, Samantha's lawyer asked to have the cases heard separately. Unfortunately for her, but not for me, the judge denied that request. He did allow a 30-minute break for her lawyer to speak with his client and the other lawyer. When they returned, her lawyer informed the judge that Samantha wanted to change her plea from not guilty to guilty of being involved in the assault causing harm. With the prosecutor's approval of the plea change, Samantha was taken into custody until her sentencing. It seemed she had made a deal with the district attorney. Kingston was not happy with Samantha's decision and made sure everyone knew it as she was escorted out of the courtroom. It was easy to understand his frustration, since her guilty plea weakened his own case. He also recognized that as part of her deal, she would have to testify against him. Samantha received a 2-year sentence with 1 year suspended. Considering the time she had already spent in custody, she would only serve about 8 months, maybe even less if she got released early. Her guilty plea meant that the video of the incident didn't need to be shown in her case anymore. I could still use it in my petition for annulment, but I would have preferred it to be part of the official record. This issue was resolved when Kingston maintained his not guilty plea and decided to represent himself in court. He was a skilled lawyer and was very confident in his abilities, believing that the idea of being a fool for a client didn't apply to him. Even though the prosecution had a recorded account of his actions, he thought he could convince the jury of his innocence. With Samantha out of the way, I was called as a witness for the prosecution in Kingston's trial. As I entered the courtroom and walked toward the witness stand, I looked quite fragile. I was nearing the end of my recovery and had lost over 10 kilograms. I still needed crutches to help me walk. Although my facial injuries had healed, the marks were still visible. I looked the part of someone who had been through a tough experience. After I gave my testimony and faced a lot of questioning from Kingston, I slowly made my way to a seat set aside for me in the courtroom. I was happy that he couldn't change my story, even though he tried to scare me. I was also glad to be there when the recording of that day was shown. The next person to speak was the doctor who had treated me after I was moved from the emergency room to the ICU. He talked about how the injuries Kingston gave me could have led to serious problems, or even my death. During his testimony, the prosecutor showed the video of the incident. Kingston jumped up, saying the video should not be allowed. "Why do you object?" the judge asked. "I didn't know my interaction with Mr. Bork was being recorded," Kingston replied. "Is that true?" the judge asked the prosecutor. "No, it's not, Your Honor," the prosecutor said. "There are signs at every entrance of the hospital that inform visitors about the cameras. These signs let people know that their actions might be recorded. The signs are also in the ICU, where cameras are used to help understand cases of serious injuries or deaths. These cameras help medical staff and, if needed, the coroner. We have signs about this at the ward's entrance and in each room." "Do you want to add anything, doctor?" he asked. "You've covered it well," the doctor said. "The cameras in the ICU help staff care for patients. In this case, the video of an attack by a visitor was an added benefit." The judge decided Kingston's argument was not strong enough and allowed the video to be shown. After watching it, the jury understood Kingston's motives and observed his true character. Once the video was accepted as evidence, the prosecutor called his last witness, Samantha Bork, to confirm what happened in my ICU room that day. She confirmed the conversation and the outcome were true. Under questioning from Kingston, she acknowledged that I had played a part in what happened by not listening to him, which he took as disrespect. She also agreed with Kingston that I had used too much force when he tried to punish me for disrespecting him, and that I should be the one defending against an assault charge, not him. When the prosecutor was asked if he had more questions for the witness, he told the judge he could call her back later if needed. I thought that was a smart move because Kingston seemed capable of making things worse for himself without any help from the prosecutor. Kingston's choice to speak for himself was a big mistake. He thought it would help his case, but it actually made things worse because it allowed the prosecution to question him. During this questioning, he admitted that the words on the recording were his. He also had to acknowledge that my reaction was self-defense, since he was about to hit me when it happened. His acceptance of the video's accuracy led to more questions about what was discussed in the recording, especially about his relationship with Sam. He confirmed that he had been Sam's main partner for the last 2 years, but she had started being involved with others at the firm shortly after she began working there, even before I met her. He also mentioned that, as her mentor, he had suggested she find a husband who would fit into their way of life. It seemed she thought I would be the right choice. "So," the prosecutor asked, "did any of your gatherings involve people who were not part of your close group?" "We sometimes invited speakers and lecturers at seminars and conferences," Kingston replied. "However, while some might frown upon our activities, we didn't do anything illegal, unless it involved exchanging favors for something else, which could be seen as bribery or corruption," the prosecutor said. Did any guests who came to your gatherings repay your hospitality with favors, Mr. Kingston? I object to this line of questioning, Your Honor, Kingston said, appealing to the judge. This question goes beyond what we are discussing in this court case. I'm afraid you opened this topic, Mr. Kingston, the judge said, when you admitted to letting people outside your group join in your activities. Please continue, Mr. Prosecutor. Thank you, Your Honor. So you invited guest speakers and others to join your events. Would you like to name those guests, Mr. Kingston? That was when Kingston stopped talking, claiming he had the right to stay silent because it could get him into trouble for things not related to this case. This was similar to the American practice of pleading the fifth, which we often hear about in courtroom stories. Just one more question, and then I will be finished, Mr. Kingston, the prosecutor said. Besides your attempt to hurt Mr. Bork on the night you claimed you owned his wife, which you have admitted, did you, alone or with Mrs. Bork's help, make plans to have Mr. Bork removed so he couldn't cause you more trouble? I object, Your Honor, Kingston shouted. That suggestion is ridiculous and has nothing to do with this case. Once again, Mr. Kingston, the judge said, the evidence already presented has made it necessary to ask this question. You need to answer the prosecutor's question. Then no, Your Honor, Kingston replied. I never arranged to have Mr. Bork harmed, before or after the events that brought me here. I may have threatened him in anger, but I never meant to act on those words. I felt a smile come to my face as I heard his denial. He had just made himself open to a charge of lying under oath. That would be added to the list of serious charges he already faced when Manyweather's statement was brought up in his next trial. When she was called to the stand again by the prosecution, Samantha confirmed her role in Kingston's plans, including picking me to help cover her actions and the timeline he had shared. I regret choosing Aaron, she said when asked if she ever had feelings for me. As I got to know him better, I saw how kind and generous he really is. I think I even started to care for him, but I couldn't let my feelings get in the way of my goals. I'm sorry, Aaron, she said, looking at me from across the courtroom, tears rolling down her cheeks. You didn't deserve the disrespect and humiliation I caused you. I felt she sounded sincere. I thought about the honesty she had shown during our early relationship and the first few years of our marriage. I realized those feelings had changed. It seemed like she was crying fake tears to get sympathy from the court. After the judge allowed her a moment to calm down, the questioning started again. For the rest of that day and most of the next, Samantha's testimony focused on her relationships with her coworkers and clients. Like Kingston, she would not mention any names, saying she didn't want to get herself into trouble over issues that were not connected to this case. Kingston raised many objections during her testimony, some of which the judge agreed with, but most were overruled. Like her mentor, Samantha refused to answer questions about her role in any harmful planning against me. She said, "It may incriminate me in matters unrelated to this case." When Kingston questioned her, she admitted that her relationships were voluntary and that she was not forced. "Unless you consider that my job might benefit from my involvement," she added. After Kingston finished, the prosecutor asked some follow-up questions to address points raised by the defense. "Did you receive payment for being involved in these activities?" he asked. "Not exactly a payment," Samantha replied. "I did get bonuses beyond my usual pay. I saw them as just recognition for the extra work I was doing." "So, you didn't think of them as payment for anything inappropriate?" "I absolutely did not," she said, clearly upset. "I find that suggestion offensive." "I apologize if I upset you," the prosecutor said, pretending to be sorry. "That was not my intention." He quietly said to himself as he began to sit down, "I just stated the truth." "Oh, one last thing," he said, standing up again as Samantha prepared to leave the stand. "Did you keep a record of your extra activities while working at Morton City Law?" Yes," she answered shyly, glancing at Kingston. "And where was that record kept?" "On my personal laptop and also in my online account," she replied. "Thank you, Mrs. Bork," the prosecutor said. "That will be all." As Samantha was taken out of the courtroom and back for transport to the women's prison, Kingston shouted, "You foolish woman!" The jury found their admissions to be very telling, and their discussions only lasted a few hours, part of which was taken up by their break. When they returned to the courtroom, the spokesperson announced that the jury had found the accused guilty. Breaking from the usual rules, she asked the judge to give the harshest sentence allowed and to think about the serious injuries I had suffered when deciding on a parole period. Even though the evidence shows there was no planning behind this, Your Honor, the spokesperson explained, the doctor's testimony about Mr. Bork stood out in our discussions. The doctor stated that if the attack had happened anywhere other than the ICU, Mr. Bork would have certainly died. The judge reminded the spokesperson that she was going beyond what the jury was supposed to do, but he said he would think about her comments. At Kingston's sentencing hearing a week later, the judge said he had to ignore the jury's recommendations because their role ended with the verdict. However, he still gave the sentence they had asked for. Kingston was found guilty of serious bodily harm. The judge decided on a longer sentence because he committed the crime with others. He received 5 years and 6 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 4 years and 5 months because of the violent nature of the attack. As he was led away to a prison van, Kingston claimed he would appeal. Soon, he would be trading his nice suit for basic prison clothes. Since Kingston's confession and the video of my attack were accepted as evidence during his trial, along with Samantha admitting her part in the attack, I asked Brad to finish and file the paperwork to annul my marriage. Both the hospital video and the records of Kingston and Samantha's statements were shown to the family court to support my annulment request. Within a month after the hearing, I learned that I was no longer married, and in fact, I had never been. This meant Samantha had no right to any of my belongings, which weren't worth much anyway due to the family trust. The only thing she might have considered was my old Mustang, which still needed fixing. Samantha was informed of the court's ruling in August while she was still in prison. I also made sure Kingston knew he was free to pursue a relationship with her if he wanted, after she had turned against him. I later found out that neither of them reacted well to the news, with Kingston taking it harder than Samantha. I found some satisfaction in their disappointment. But just like a word spoken can't be taken back, a dead man's switch, once set off, can't be turned off again. I had warned Kingston on the day he attacked me that it was likely too late for him to avoid the trouble that was about to come. The serious charges against him and Samantha were only the start of their troubles. Their earlier convictions would keep them from getting out while investigators looked into more serious matters, some of which they had admitted to on video and in court. According to Tony Marino, it was uncertain whether the next charges would be about drug offenses or conspiracy. I thought it would be the conspiracy charge. With Manyweather and Charlie no longer involved and the recordings of their planning meeting, it seemed easier to prove. The drug charges would take longer because of the many other people involved. If successful, and I saw no reason why they wouldn't be, they could face an additional 7 to 10 years added to their sentences. This time would help prosecutors build a strong case against everyone involved in both drug and corruption cases, especially now that Samantha's diary was in the picture. The real problem for Samantha and Kingston was that no matter how long they spent in prison, their dreams of being lawyers were over. Regardless of how any further trials went, neither would ever practice law again. I wondered if, while lying alone in their cells at night, either of them thought about their plan to embarrass me in front of so many people not long ago, and if they realized it might not have been such a great idea. Most of all, I hoped they understood what I meant when I raised my finger in their direction. Just in case they didn't, I made a mental note to visit them someday when they were free, to remind them of what I had promised. After all, a promise is a promise, and they now knew I meant what I said. This left me with one lingering question about my own life. As this chapter came to an end, could I hope for a happy ending to my story? Or was I meant to live a less than happy life? Hey everyone! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.